What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and typically I'm analyzing apologists' claim to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. But today we are talking with Dr. Richard Carrier. Rick has written a lot of books on the topic of mythicism. Well, I say a lot. It's proving history about the methodology, and then you've got on the historicity of Jesus, and then you've got Jesus from outer space. So that by comparison to the rest of
and technically Hitler Home Bible Christ is a little bit has some articles relevant to the subject, but right, I classify as having published the most pro mythicist things under peer review, I guess, of anybody so far. But I've made a whole career out of studying it simply because I got a good postdoc research grant to do that, and so that sealed my fate ever since. Here I am.
So Rick has a website, richardcarrier.info, where he blogs at, and he's got a great website. It's very, very well informed, obviously, but he puts out a lot of great content that you can really use to educate yourself on various topics, not just on mythicism or biblical scholarship or anything like that, but just in general, like on stuff concerning history. Rick's blog is really good. Now he does have a Patreon where you can pledge a certain amount every month and help the blog out there. I would suggest it. I don't pledge to your Patreon, but I managed to be able to find other ways.
It's absolutely awesome. I'm one of the last long form bloggers. This is like a dinosaur technology now, but it can't die. We actually need this. Like, we need articles that are long and detailed on particular subjects and well written enough that you're not bored reading them, right? And then giving you useful information on various topics. I do modern philosophy, naturalist and atheist philosophy, as well as ancient history. I do ancient science, ancient technology, ancient religion, ancient Christianity, obviously biblical studies, and occasionally I also do like contemporary social and political subjects. But anyway, I've got all of that on the blog. You're right.
Yes, definitely.
And at richardcarrier.info, you can find my Facebook there and my Twitter. And there's a page you can find on my blog called Guide to My Social Media that tells you what I do on each one. So based on what you want to follow or keep up on, you can see which thing you want to follow or keep up on. And then, of course, I have a link to my classes. So I do online classes. They're forum-based, asynchronous forum-based classes, except for one that and more will come out. With MythVision, I actually have produced a 8-lecture video course with a syllabus, and that comes with certain perks. You can, if you want to, the interactive part of that would be you get to ask questions on my blog. So just find a relevant article to your question, post your question, mention you're a student, and you're guaranteed to get in and eventually pass through the moderation, and I'll answer the question. So, and that's a lifetime thing. So as long as MythVision stays around, you can go back and watch the videos, go back and look at the syllabuses and things like that. So I'm going to be transitioning all my classes to that format, and it's really good. I had to rewatch the whole thing to make corrections or edits or add slides and stuff. And as I've said, it's a decent 8-lecture thing. The syllabus alone, I think, is pretty useful for people who want to dive in. If you're just an average person, like even just a smart high school graduate, but you want to do biblical studies and even get at the Greek, get at the underlying Greek of the New Testament, I teach all the skills in that about how to do that, how to approach the scholarship, and how to have your basic orientation of what do mainstream scholars already assume is the case, right? As opposed to what apologists tell you. And then the literature, so that you actually can go confirm that, right? So you can actually check everything I say, because I give you all of the resources for doing that. That's the point of that. So it's to make people better at doing biblical studies, or at least New Testament studies on the internet, like make you a better internet warrior in that subject. That's the point of that course. And so I think you're an affiliate, right? So is there a link to that?
Yes.
Under
Yes. On the video here, there's a link down below that has Richard Carrier tagged on it. It's godlessengineering.com/NT studies course. So if you want to get a really good handle on the New Testament from like a beginner's kind of standpoint, that's a really good course to go through. Now, I haven't been through that course yet. I have plans to. I've just been really busy, but I have been through other courses that you've offered in other places, and that's where I learned like my skills in checking like the Greek and what it says, and being able to compare things, and just being generally knowledgeable in this area. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate all the courses that I've taken from you. So I highly recommend the course. Go down there, check it out. It's really affordable too. So y'all consider that.
And I don't know if anybody who's watching is a content creator, but I've just launched this course, and so I'm looking for ways to promote it. Get people. I want people to have the skills, but also obviously I make a commission. John makes a commission if you buy through the link that he provides. But if you're a content creator and you want to promote it as well and make a little bit of dosh, get a little commission on selling these courses, I've promised that I will do a half an hour free talk on your show. So if you've got a podcast or a video or anything like that, and then just get in touch with me, become affiliate, get in touch with me, and I'll fill you in, and we can figure it out. And yeah, it's a free half hour with Richard Carrier asking me anything you want about New Testament studies, basically.
Awesome. So coming up on the channel this week, we're not going to have a Monday video, but I'll probably have the Bible study ready, and of course Skeptic Mafia here on the channel. We'll have a Skeptic Mafia podcast for y'all this week, and then later on in the week I got a special video that's very ranty, probably going to be kind of long, but it's also going to be very analytical about a certain piece of drama that probably shouldn't exist but does exist. So
I like it. Always love that.
Yeah. So with all of that out of the way, I do want to say that I'll be on the line tomorrow night, starting at 6 p.m. Central. And if you have any problems with whatever we say here tonight, you can call in tomorrow night and you can give me a little bit of hell. Okay, so I love being given hell on the line, so definitely call in with all of your grievances there. So now with all of that out of the way, what we're talking about tonight is Philo's Angel. There's been a lot of controversy, I have to say. Well, I don't know why, but there's been a lot of controversy lately over this particular aspect, I guess, of the background information to the minimal mythicist argument. And it's been misrepresented in several different ways. We're going to be looking at two different people trying to take on the argument tonight and try to refute the argument, but we'll have to see if they're successful. I have my doubts. But where I wanted to start off tonight was Dr. Carrier. Could you kind of give us the rundown of the argument? Like what is or who is Philo's Archangel, and how does that factor into the minimal mythicist argument?
Yeah, so what we're talking about is Philo of Alexandria, who's a notable Jewish theologian. He wrote and thrived somewhere between 20 and 40 AD. So his work is largely pre-Christian and certainly contemporary with Paul, and predates Paul's letters. And he's a very significant figure because Christians preserved a ton of his stuff. Not all of his stuff, but a lot of it. So we actually have a lot of his books. And it gives us a lot of information about this sort of Hellenistic Talmudic interpretation of scriptures. It's a very allegorical interpretation of scripture, very philosophical way of analyzing theology from a Jewish perspective. So he's a very important author in that regard. And he wrote tons and tons of things. And so he says tons and tons of things. So you can find him saying all kinds of weird stuff. It makes it very useful. He'll throw away comments that like tell you like more information than he even thinks that he's talking about, but he's referring to things that he expects the audience to know already. And so we can infer things from that. So it's actually useful to use this author, and a lot of scholars look at Philo for this reason, especially because he represents a lot of early Jewish thought that becomes Christian thought. So the Christians really liked Philo's thinking, and a lot of Christian theology evolved out of Philonic theology, which is why we have so much of Philo, because the medieval Christians really loved his stuff. So this is the author we're talking about. And there's a book, one of his books, which is on the confusion of tongues, which is about the Tower of Babel and the fall of languages. But he's mostly just like this kind of mystical Deepak Chopra wackadoo etymology book, right? So he's talking about all these words and what their secret mystical meanings are and things like that. And it's kind of like a random hodgepodge of stuff like that. And there's at one point he quotes Zechariah 6 verse 12, and where it talks about someone being called the Anatole, which means east or rising. It refers, Anatole is the rising of the sun. So it's a word that can mean east, but it literally means rising. So rising one, rising thing, just rising as an abstract concept and so on. And what it looks like he's doing is he looks like he's referring to a particular character in that passage and saying they're being called the Anatole. And then he says, well, this is you might wonder, well, that's a weird thing to call a regular human. But no, this isn't a human. It's actually the firstborn son of God, who's the creator of the universe, etc. We'll probably bring up the exact passage later when it'll come up, I'm sure. And anyway, so he says this, and he says this, there's particular attributes of this entity that we know in other places, including in the same book, but in other books he's written. He constantly talks about this entity, which is the Logos, the high priest of God's celestial temple, the firstborn son of God, the image of God, God's agent of creation, the Logos, the Paraclete, and a variety of these other phrases that all got applied to Jesus. So it seemed, and he calls it's an archangel. So it's the archangel of many names, he says. So it has many more names than he mentions. He doesn't discuss its names very often, and that's because Jewish theologians often didn't. They regarded the names of angels as something you don't just casually talk about. We know that from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but he says this is the angel of many names, and he gives it all these attributes, and he's referring to the same angel in this passage. And if you read it a certain way, and I think the evidence implies very strongly, and this is what I argue for on the historicity of Jesus, that he thinks the person named Jesus in that verse in Zechariah 6, chapter 12, or verse 12, the person named Jesus there, he thinks that's the one being called Anatole, which means that that's one of the names that he thinks this angel has. And that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the name Anatole, and he's not interested in the name Jesus. But you can infer from what he says that that's actually, he thinks it's the Jesus that's named this, which means that he thinks that there's an angel named Jesus with all the attributes of our Jesus, right? So this would imply that there was already this pre-existent idea in Jewish angelology that the Christians just glommed onto. Now, this I do not use as an argument against the historicity of Jesus. I use it in my background section, so it's just information you need to know in order to properly assess the probabilities of other things. Because it's equally compatible with a historical or a non-historical Jesus, because it's pretty much undisputed, and certainly, some people will dispute it, but it's a lot of scholars now are agreeing that the first Christians, certainly Paul, probably the Christians before him, believe that Jesus was a pre-existent being, the creator of the universe, etc., and he has all of these attributes that are the same attributes that Philo assigns to this angel. And so they clearly believe that. So if Jesus existed, they believed it of the historical Jesus. They thought that he was actually an incarnate angel that came down to Galilee and preached and stuff and died and so whatever. And so they did believe this. There's good evidence for this, and a lot of scholars agree that that's the case. The only thing that would be controversial here is my suggestion that Philo understood the name to be Jesus of this already before Christianity. This angel was already named Jesus. And that's disputable. I think there's a good argument for it, but in my book, I explain this is just an argument for it. It's not something he explicitly says. But all the other stuff he says is a fact. It is an established background fact, and this changes the way we look at the origins of Christianity. It doesn't make the historicity of Jesus more or less likely, but it does change how we understand the origins of Christianity and how it developed, and that can affect the probabilities that you assign to certain things when you're trying to evaluate competing theories of the origins of Christianity, especially if one of them is a mythical origin theory. And so that's the basic idea.
Yeah, and people have taken this idea and kind of run with it and have invented their own versions.
Yeah, super freaked people out. Like this, it freaked people out way more than it should have. And a lot of the critics immediately glom onto this as if it was an argument I used against the historicity of Jesus. Moreover, they'll even claim that it is the central argument of my book, which is it's not. It's like one tiny little point I make in the background evidence chapter that I don't even use as evidence against the historicity of Jesus. But clearly it touched a nerve because people really freaked out about this and are desperately trying to come up with ways to get rid of it as evidence.
Well, and it's people I'm thinking specifically of one person that you have directly talked to
Yeah.
and have walked through the argument and have expressed, that, this is background knowledge. This is before we even consider any of the evidence. So it doesn't make like any kind of determination about his historicity. You've literally told this to the person and they're now like, this is the entire argument. Like for minimal mythicism, this is the entire argument.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
we're going to be discussing that later on in the week on the channel. But today we have a couple of different, I guess, issues that people have come up with your hypothesis.
Right.
So if you're ready for it, we can just jump into the first one.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Add to stream. There we go. Oh yeah, and then yeah, that's not working out right there. Anyways, okay. So, all right. So here we go. What we've got is we've got Derek Lambert from Myth Vision, which, this we're not addressing Derek here. Derek's a great host over there on his channel, but we are going to be discussing McGrath, James McGrath, which you've blogged about. Actually, you've got an extensive set of blogs about McGrath. So I'm very interested.
Yeah, he says a lot of false things in a lot of places. I find it very annoying. Similar to a lot of Christian apologists. I think he's more on the liberal side of argumentation, but he's definitely argues like a Christian apologist. And so, yeah, I take issue with a lot of the things that he said, unrelated to this subject, but on this subject as well, but like tons of other things. But people are interested in that can search his name on my blog at richardcarrier.info and find a lot of alarming things that he's claimed that are obviously false.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and jump on into this, and people are not going to be surprised by who sparks this conversation.
But to dive into something you...
Yeah. Can you hear that fine there, Rick?
I hear it fine. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
Brought up, your teacher, James Dunn, is known for showing that pre-existent Jesus teachings aren't necessarily what Paul was saying. And that leads me to the first super chat from my buddy Neil, Gnostic Informant. Is there any evidence whatsoever of any pre-existing angelic Jesus before Paul from any Jewish tradition? We know that the mythicist model says that, or at least depends on the particular one. I think it's Dr. Carrier's position that is saying that Jesus was an angelic figure, a pre-existent angel, celestial angel, the Logos, as Philo. And didn't know if you know of any pre-existent angelic Jesus before Paul from any Jewish tradition. It's a good question.
So I first wanted to ask you, do you think that that's a pretty well-formed question?
No.
Like right off the bat?
No, already like he's disingenuously framing the question, right? This is a classic like lawyer leading question, fallacy of leading question. The question isn't really whether the name was already Jesus. Like one could argue that too. But when he's talking about Dunn, for instance, he introduced it with Dunn's argument, and it would be Dunn in argument with Hurtado and Ehrman and so forth. There's a lot of scholars who argue the opposite of Dunn, which is that yes, that Jesus was a pre-existent angelic being. The debate really is whether did anyone identify that angel by the name Jesus before Christianity came along? And so, which I completely accept as a valid debate. But what he's asking here is making it seem like that's the only thing we're talking about is, was it named Jesus, right? And so that isn't really the question. If you're talking about the Dunn argument, we're talking about a completely different thing. And it's not the question of whether it was named Jesus, but just the question of whether there was a pre-existent being that Christians thought Jesus was the incarnation of. And that's a different question. So because the question has been asked misleadingly, we have to be a little fair to McGrath here because we're not exactly sure what question he thinks he's supposed to be answering. And so he might give one answer that's an answer to that question, which is different from the question I think one should be asking him. But anyway.
Right. And what, because of who this is coming from and what this person has said, if you were to be convincingly proved wrong that you can't attribute the name Jesus to this angelic figure via your argument, what kind of effect do you think that would have, like, on your case for either historicity or ahistoricity?
Yeah, it wouldn't have any effect on the probabilities, but it would affect the book. I'm currently writing a second edition. So Sheffield Phoenix has asked me to, I mean, we're already in contract to do a second edition of On the Historicity of Jesus. And rewriting, like rewording this section to prevent the kinds of mistakes that people are making in their misunderstanding of it is one of the things I'm going to do. But and doing extra research and so on to really like double check these things. But if in that process I come to realize like, oh no, that argument is stupid, it doesn't hold up, we can't maintain that, then I would take that part out and put it in a footnote and say like, previously I thought this and it's not the case, etc. But that wouldn't change the rest of the section, right? Which is all the other angelic attributes, which not apart from the name. Like what dropping the name doesn't really have much of an effect. Dropping the other attributes might have an effect. Like if there's no such angel that they could be attributing Jesus to be, that might have an effect on some of the other probabilities. I haven't worked that out, but the background evidence is so solid on that point that I don't see any reason to even contemplate that.
Yeah, I believe because I've been reading How Jesus Became God due to one of your citations in one of your blogs, but I've been reading that here lately, and it seems like even Ehrman recognizes like.
Oh yeah, do you have that screenshot? Should I bring it up? Which is the capture from his book, the quote. I think we should show people that actually because it illustrates what I'm talking about.
Okay.
He's on the side of me on this, not with the name, but with the rest of it.
Right.
Let me see if I can find that. I'll keep looking for it. You can stall while I'm doing that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've got the Kindle version or the digital like Kindle.
If you have it already, you can bring it up. Go ahead and do that. I'm quickly because I took a screenshot and I'm just going to quickly look for that now.
Okay.
Okay, it's taking me longer than I thought. So go do what you need to do.
Yeah, sorry. I was trying to get to it because I was actually at the Moses part.
Oh yeah,
where he talks about Moses, which that's kind of an interesting part too, because I had no idea that that Philo actually thinks, or at least in some portions, thinks of Moses as a divine figure that's given a body, who's sent down to become the ruler of the Jews or the king of the Jews.
Yeah.
And then once he dies, he's exalted back up into heaven, and which it sounds eerily similar.
All right. If I drop it into comments, or in the private chat, can you load it up? Let's see if that works.
Probably.
Even, if it'll let me drop it in. Hold on.
You could either do that or through Facebook.
Oh, Facebook. Let me do that. There, that worked. Okay, it's coming up.
Yep,
I think that's the one.
Yep. Okay. 1 second.
Yeah.
Get this brought up. Okay.
And this has what we're going to show as Ehrman talking about other books that Philo wrote where he talks about this angel. I quote more. There's like more passages than the ones that Ehrman uses. On the Historicity of Jesus, I cite a bunch of those. If we want to get into that, I've got those screen capped as well.
Yep. Okay.
Did you get it?
yeah, I got it there, Rick. Yes, honey, he's got citations. Sorry, my Casey's getting a bit spicy over there. Okay. Here we go. I've sized this to where it's kind of cutting off our heads a little bit. But okay, there we go.
That's fine.
All right, so this is from How Jesus Became God. This is like page. Well, I think this was on page like 72. Maybe
I don't know, but
Moses is on 85.
This is a shot from the Kindle. So,
right.
But anyway, it's exact from how Jesus became God, and he starts in the first paragraph talking about Philo's idea of the Logos being an entity that was born to wisdom and is actually like fathered by God, etc. And then, but it's the second paragraph that I have all highlighted there, where Ehrman's talking about the same thing I am, and this is it. So. It says, Philo calls Logos the image of God and the name of God and the firstborn son. In one place, he indicates that God gives the title of God to his chief Logos because the Logos is God and God is God. Philo sometimes speaks of two gods, and in other places speaks of Logos as the second God. But there is a difference for Philo between the God and a God, and for obvious reasons, and Logos is the latter. So they're not identical. This isn't the Nicene Creed. This is what's called emanation theory. This is a common Jewish theology at the time, which is that the archangels were all like emanations of God. So they like share in the participate in the entity, the essence of God, but they're not identical to God. They're like agents of God, little parts of God, basically. Think of like limbs or whatever of God. So they're not identical to God, but they are God-like because they have all the powers and properties of gods as pagans would understand it. And he says, Philo sometimes maintained that the Logos was indeed the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord is the one who does all the was believed to do all the appearances in the Old Testament. So like in the Hellenistic period, Second Temple period, Jews started reinterpreting passages in the Old Testament so that the burning bush, for example, or the incident where Jacob wrestles with God in the street, right? Like there's these instances, and then there's one where Moses sees the backside of God, like he sees God's naked ass. Like these are in the book. I'm telling you, they're in the Old Testament. So there's a lot of these, like people see God or interact with God physically. And the Hellenistic period, they reinterpreted God as some sort of like abstract entity that exists up in the seventh heaven and never deigns to, you can't look at him because it would like burn you up. And so you can't like interact with God. He has to have intermediaries, and that's the point of angels. And so they reinterpreted these passages as the angel of God, which later was called the Metatron, which is speaks for God. And people who know the movie Dogma will know this because the angelology in Dogma is actually correct in that movie. So the Metatron is like speaks the voice of God and appears on behalf of God so that you don't die when you see God. And so the burning bush was the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord is the one that goes and kills everybody when God gets mad, right? So it says the angel of the Lord to kill people. The person that Jacob wrestled in the street was the angel of God, and so on. And so Philo thinks this angel, the firstborn son of God, the image of God, the creator being, and all of this stuff is the angel of the Lord, the Logos, and so on. So all of this stuff existed in Jewish theology before Christianity even borrowed any of this stuff. So when you see Christians borrowing this stuff, they're not making it up. Like this is stuff they're getting from standard Jewish theology. Like it's even the Gospel of John, John 1, nothing in there is contrary to Philo. It's all straightforward Jewish theology. And people often forget that, like, because apologists want to push John 1 as arguing for the Trinity concept, but he's not, because there's a key word in there where he says that the Logos was God, past tense, right? And that's a really key important thing to mention there, because when he comes down as Jesus, he's no longer God, right? It's the future from the time when God was all things and all things were in God. But then God started emanating pieces of himself into archangels and then tasking them with things like creating the universe. And so there's this angel that creates the universe on God's behalf. And that's the Logos. And so like in the beginning, they were all parts of God. And so they were identical to God. But then they became angels. Then they created separately as separate entities. And so the incarnation in John it's not identical to God. It's a piece of God, you could say, but it's not identical to God. Jesus is this archangelic entity, this Logos entity. And we can see evidence in Paul that he believed this already. Even though Paul never uses the word Logos, he assigns all the same attributes that Philo assigns to the Logos. So we know he thinks that this is the same angel that Jesus is. So the question is that they think Jesus became incarnate. And so the question is, do they think this was an actual historical guy that was the descended angel become incarnate? Or did that never happen on earth and they only learned of this like in Revelation and things like that? And so that's the difference between Bar Ehrman's position, which is that they thought this of an actual historical man, and my position, which is that there was never a historical man. They just always thought this incarnation happened somewhere else. No one actually witnessed it. You only learned of it through secret codes in scripture and revelations. And so that's the only real difference between Ehrman and myself, apart from the fact that I think that Philo already recognized that Jesus, which means Savior of God, was already the name of this angel. Now, that's my argument, and that's in my book. And I explicitly paint it out there as an argument. It's something to infer, not something that's an established fact. And so those are the only two differences between me and Ehrman on this. So it'd be interesting to see now what McGrath says when we get to that.
Yeah, there is one. So now, normally for conversations like this, I wait until the very end to do super chats. So if you got a question for us, specifically for Dr. Carrier, you want to challenge us a little bit, definitely send in a super chat and ask us. We will be answering those at the end. But in order to make sure that we answer it, you need to do a super chat. But there is one that I wanted to cover right now because it's very topic oriented. The Yellow Stoic asks, did Dr. Ehrman change on this point despite Carrier's Wikipedia page still listing it as a point of criticism?
I never read my Wikipedia page, so I don't know what's there. I don't know who puts things there, or edits them, or whatever. It's gauche to edit your own Wikipedia page, so I don't do that either. So people who want to go edit it are welcome to, as long as they do it honestly and make it true. Yes, there was a time when Ehrman criticized me for taking this position. And even though my position is taken by numerous scholars, there's a huge peer-reviewed literature that's on my side on this, that was actually I'm responding to, that I actually cite in my book. Like, I'm building on that research, right? And then when Ehrman came out with how Jesus became God, I think even in the book he admits he flipped on this. Like, he doesn't mention me, but he says, like, I used to think this was bogus, but then I read all the literature and now I'm convinced. And I'm like, yeah, that's what happened to me. I read all I thought it was bogus too. I thought the idea was a later Christian apologetic. Then I read all the literature and the evidence, and I was like, yeah, okay, they're right. I think this is actually the case. And the same thing happened to Ehrman when he checked the literature. And so his book, he cites a bunch of this scholarship, not like some things even that I didn't cite, some of the things I did. And he doesn't cite all of it. I don't cite all of it, but both of us together, it's a huge list of authors scholars who've done this, who've come to this conclusion. Larry Hurtado is one of them. The only thing Hurtado differs with us is that he doesn't like the name angel. He doesn't think it should be an angel. It's some other kind of pre-existent, eternal, created celestial being than an angel. That's a weird semantic dispute, but in terms of the substance of what we're talking about, Larry Hurtado was on our side as well. So up to his death. So anyway, so that's some background on that.
Okay. And then let's get back to the video. Sorry, hold on one second.
Yeah, I have no idea what McGrath says here. This is my first time seeing it.
Oh yeah, you'll definitely be not surprised by this. All right.
It's a good question. So Richard Carrier has claimed that in Philo of Alexandria, as he's discussing, there is essentially an angelic figure, a celestial figure named Jesus. What's being talked about there, and this is one of the strong arguments against that view, is Philo is doing his usual sort of allegorical and symbolic interpretation of Jewish scripture, and he's discussing a Jewish text in which there is a character, a historical individual, right, named Joshua, right? And Joshua gets rendered in Greek as Jesus, which then becomes Jesus in English. And so both the fact that that's an allegorical discussion of Philo allegorizes everything, right? And so it doesn't mean that anyone believed the question of whether there was a historical Abraham, there was a historical anyone, but we read those stories and we say these are, myths, legends, whatever they are, about purported human ancestors, right? And in this case, it's a discussion about a historical high priest, but it's allegorized. And Joshua is a very common human name, right? We have typical names for angels, right? You get, before they were Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? Raphael and others were, angelic figures. So I guess there's a parallel we could draw there, but that's not where I'm going with this. But, angelic names are distinct, right? They have certain characteristics, and eventually some of those become human names, right? As, the centuries pass, right? So nowadays you might have a Gabriel and a Michael, but those start out as angelic names that are not found, applied to humans. And Joshua was a human name, right? It's the name of several characters, right? Whether actually historical or not, right? Who are purportedly historical, right? They're people, characters in the human realm. And so I think what's going on there is that sort of allegorization. So I would say, no, there isn't an angelic Jesus. And I'm not sure whether there is one even in Paul, had that discussion with.
Yeah, he goes on to discuss his disagreement with Ehrman on it, and there's about, this is only about half of the discussion is being had here, but it seems like he's saying that there's no way that you could consider the name of this angel to be Jesus, because that's not the typical kind of name that an angel would have, and so that apparently refutes like the position.
Yeah, that's weird, because it's a passage in which he's saying the name of the angel is Anatole, which violates his principle. So the passage itself refutes everything that McGrath just said, right? So clearly Philo thinks one of the names of this angel of many names. Remember, Philo says it's an angel of many names, so it has many names. I'm sure one of those names is one of the L names. So like Michael, Gabriel, like all the angels have the L name because it's God, basically. God's this, God's that. It's an attribute and then the name of God, right? So Ariel, Uriel, like that's a typical angelic name. Jesus has one of those names, by the way. It's Emmanuel, right? So that is an angelic name. Of course, no one ever calls him by that name except one time in one verse in Matthew. And I think even that is a literary device, because Emmanuel means God is with us. And that happens at the beginning of Matthew. And at the end of Matthew, Jesus says, I am with you always. Right? That's an obvious mythic device, right? It's a sandwich.
Yeah.
It starts with the God is going to be with us. He says he's going to be with us. Therefore, he's God. He represents God in any case. He is the agent of God. So anyway, that's an angelic name. But that's an example of how Jesus himself has multiple names. He has Jesus. He's Emmanuel. He's the Lamb. He's the Logos. The Logos is another angelic name, right? That is not ending in L. So Philo talks about this angel. The angel is the Logos. His name is Logos. His name is Anatole. So Philo already repeatedly identifies many of the names of this angel being non-L names, right? So we know that's the case. So this whole argument that McGrath is giving, which is a bit garbled, I think people who heard it might not have even understood what McGrath was saying. And I think this comes from Hurtado. This is Hurtado's argument, but it's false. And there are actually other examples. We have lots of other angels that have names that don't end in L. So Layla, for example, Layla is the angel of night that collects human semen. Now, this is in the Talmud. This is an actual thing. But the name of this angel is Layla. It's not an L name. The Metatron is not an L name. There are other names. There's lists of angels in other books, ancient Jewish books, that include names. I was trying to find some examples right now, but I can't find them on the fly. But I have a list somewhere. But there are other angelic names that don't end in L, that don't follow this rule. So that argument is dead in the water. Like it's contrary. It's directly refuted by the very passage that he's talking about. It's refuted by Philo multiple other places, and it's refuted by other evidence of Jewish angelology. So that's not a sound argument. And it's interesting, though, that he makes that argument, because it seems he's granting everything else, which is very comforting to me. He's granting that Philo is talking about Joshua, and he's only saying like, oh, well, Joshua can't be an angel because of this. When later, when we get to the point where we bring up the actual passage, you'll see there's no dispute that he's talking about this angelic creator being, obviously, right? So then that's why it becomes problematic if you admit that he's talking about Jesus in that passage, because now, we got to get rid of that. We can't have that be the case. But I think he's trying to get rid of it a different way. He's trying to get rid of it with this names argument, which is bogus.
Yeah, and honestly, he doesn't seem like he seems to be taking the question that was levied very strictly. Like he's strictly addressing this idea, the straw man idea of a pre-existent angelic Jesus, like specifically Jesus being,
that's a good point.
claimed.
Yeah, he did take it, which is how the question was asked, right? So I've made that point, as the question is disingenuous. The way it's framed, he's asking, was this angel named Jesus? Not did it exist in Jewish angelology? Not that kind of question. But he takes it, and that's fair, right? That's the question he was asked. He's answering the question he was asked, right? If someone was aware of this, the disingenuousness of the question, they might say, well, yeah, there are a lot of scholars who say that this angelic being, and like you said, like he's in argument with Ehrman on this. He disagrees with Ehrman. So he could say, there are scholars like Ehrman and many others who think Christians believe that there was this pre-existent archangel, and they think it's the same one that Philo's talking about. I disagree with Ehrman on that, but I acknowledge that there's a lot of people who agree, and there's clearly, therefore, there's a lot of evidence for that. And then he could have parsed it and said, but I don't find any evidence. I don't see any evidence that it was ever named Jesus. And then that would lead into his answer, which is like, I don't think it could be Jesus because angels were never given non-L names, which is a bogus argument. But that's typical of McGrath. Like, he makes stuff up off the armchair, doesn't check these things. And so he just trusted Hurtado, and Hurtado said this, which is astonishing. Like, Hurtado, of all people, should know there are lots of angel names that aren't conforming to the L format. Nonetheless, he says this, and McGrath just believes him. He doesn't check. And I find this in biblical studies a lot. It's like people just believe things. Like, if someone tells them something, they just believe it, and they don't check, right? Like, and that's the thing, is like, if you hear that, you go, oh, is that true? Interesting. If you know anything about angelology, you go, but what about the Metatron? What about Logos? They're angels. Mm-hmm. Wait a minute. Philo's saying this Anatole is an angel. What? Right. So anyway, that people should check, right? And if you check, you find, which is what happened to me, is I checked, and then I found like, oh crap, yeah, there actually are these things. So anyway, that's just annoying. But I think that was probably the least annoying wrong answer I've ever heard from James McGrath on something. So
yeah, and I mean, I was trying to point out how important it is to ask good questions and to not like ask these straw man-y kind of questions that, would not give you a good answer. It gives you a good answer for the straw man, but I mean, nobody's arguing for that straw man. And so
and so like, if you're a host like Derek's not an expert on all this stuff, right? He can't have read everything. And so it's clear that Derek didn't know to redirect, right? Like, someone who's familiar with this would immediately redirect that question and say, okay, interesting, but here, let me redirect that. Let me rephrase that question, et cetera, right? Like, they would get something more interesting out of it. And this isn't a criticism of Derek. Like, he can't do that, right? Like, he can't be an expert on all of these things. And so it's not possible to do that. But it is worthwhile when hosts can get up to speed on things like that, and then know to ask a follow-up question. This is a common thing, like reporters, when journalists interview presidents, for example, this so often they fail to ask the obvious follow-up question. Like they don't do a redirect. So like, even some of the most famous and accomplished journalists will fail at this. And so I think like in this, everything is so hyper technical. It's hard to even know what redirect to ask, right? Like, you're generally not going to know this. And so I can't blame people for not knowing it. It would just be cool if more people knew that, and then knew what the follow-up question should be, right? Like, so say like, well, that was a somewhat disingenuous question. Let me parse it into like another question and see what your answer is to that, for example. And there's no way, for example, Derek would know the angel argument, the name argument that McGrath just made is false, right? There's no way he would know that. Like, the only way I know that is because I did a 6-year research project on this thing, and then I read a bunch of stuff, and so I know a lot about angelology, and so I know immediately that claim is false. But that requires doing what I do, which most people can't, right? I don't have time.
Oh yeah, definitely. I wasn't trying to say Derek did anything wrong, because he did get a super chat and he just read it straight and everything. I just think that better formulations of questions when you're doing those kinds of things is always pertinent. We do have the other half of his answer to get through. Cool. But my wife, KC, does have an interesting question that she sent as a member chat. I can't show it on the screen, but she asked, she says that there are some comments in the chat about various criticisms of Greek translations. How does Dr. Carrier go about translating what in what context? So how does Dr. Carrier go about translating, and in what context?
Yeah. So I've talked about this on another show, but oftentimes I need a dictionary because I don't automatically know all the vocabulary, but I know all the grammar. But sometimes I can read at sight, right? And so there was this particular example. I can read the whole Philo passage that we're talking about. I can just look at the Greek and immediately read it, because it's the words are common. It's clearly written. There's nothing confusing about it. But if I want to like go in and dive in and like double check things, like maybe I'm wrong, maybe I know something incorrectly, maybe I'm mistranslating, I don't know, right? Like, so I'm always like self-critical that way. One of the best tools for this. Now, in my New Testament studies course, I teach a tool that is free and available to everybody, which is the Perseus website. So you can go to Perseus at Tufts. It's the Tufts University. The Perseus site allows you to do search Greek words if you know how to type them in correctly, and it'll parse the grammar. It will show you a dictionary entry, and you can click it and get the full dictionary entry. And the dictionary entry they include is the authoritative dictionary entry, the Greek English lexicon that all scholars use. So it is a top-notch ancient Greek lexicon. And so I teach people how to use that in my course. The Perseus Digital Library, it has tons of classics. So you can go into, if you go collections/texts, which is on the screen top left, that leads to, like, you can go find Josephus with Greek, and then you can click to the English and back and forth. It's a little clunky. It's not the most streamlined, but it has the English and the Greek. Has a lot of Latin now, even Arabic and stuff for people who are interested in all kinds of weird sources. But if you go to the top, so go all the way to the top again. Yeah. And to the top right, you see all search options. And if you click that, that brings you down below. Just actually click the word all search options. So people can see. Now that gives you how to search for the Greek. You can also search for Latin, by the way. They have the leading Latin dictionary in there as well. And it parses the grammar of the Latin. But also you can do the Greek, and it has that little chart up there that shows you how to type. So for a Greek symbol, what letter do you put in? They have like a kind of a translation code, transcription code for you to use to tell the computer what Greek you're looking at. And if you look on the left, you see sort of down at the bottom of the screen is English to language lookup. You can, so this is neat. You can choose Greek, and you can search English words, and it'll bring up all the dictionary entries that have that word in Greek, which is another handy thing to do. So that's a tool that I teach people in my class. And it doesn't always work, but it's the best thing we've got. There are other tools. So I go into there are other English to Greek translation helper tools available that are free. Now there's one that I use that is not free. It's a subscriber service, which is the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. So you can just type that in. I think if you type it in, it'll show you the front page. I'll do it later if it comes up. I'll actually walk people through it and show, so we can go to actually this passage in Philo, because Philo is not in Perseus, so you can't check the Greek of Philo in Perseus, but you can in the TLG, which is what I'm talking about. The TLG is every Greek text, every full book that we have ever published from the beginning of Greek literature, so Homer, etc., all the way to like the end of the Byzantine Empire, so like 15th century. So it has all Greek text. So it has everything by Philo, everything by everybody, any Greek author you can think of. If it's a full book text or mostly book text, it'll be in there in the TLG. And you can search the Greek. You can search the entire Greek corpus. So you can search words, phrases in Greek, like if you know enough Greek to be able to do that. But also you can go directly to specific authors, look at passages, and get the Greek. And that's what I do. So there have been, you and I know from back channel discussions, there have been people who've like said crazy things about what the Greek says in this passage of Philo. And I said, well, you could go into the TLG and like look and see that that's not the case, right? Anyway, I might give a demonstration of that later. We'll see. But I don't want to dive into that right now. I want to let's get at the things that you've got. If getting at the parsing of the Greek matters, then we'll do that, and I'll walk people through and I'll show how that works.
Okay, awesome. Let's see, get this screen shared again. Boom. Okay, let's see what else McGrath has.
Oh wait, before we do that, I found my other angels. Haha. Angels that don't end in L. Okay. Satan. Duh. Lucifer. Another name. Abaddon. Yeah. Metatron. Layla, which I mentioned. There's a Shemihaza. And Enoch and Elijah are also the names assigned to angels because they were turned into angels in some traditions. Sandalphon is another one. Anyway, so this is an example. There are other angelic names, but the Satan and Lucifer is like a no-brainer. That's one of the people like, come on, people. Also Azazel is another. So Azazel is the L name. for Satan, right? So, but Satan is another name that he has. Lucifer is another name that he has, right? So, not all the name angels. Every angel probably has an L name, but not every name an angel has is an L name, and that's easily demonstrable. So, like, okay, that was McGrath's previous segment, so we've just destroyed that. Let's do the next argument.
Yeah, and just as a side, it seems like Jesus follows that particular pattern, though, because he's got Emmanuel that he's known as, right?
Yeah.
And that's supposedly derived from Scripture, and then he's also got Jesus that he's also known as.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that so the Jehovah's Witnesses have long argued that Jesus is secretly Michael, which is Mikael, which is an L name. And there's actually so that book, I wrote a blog on this book, but the book itself is great. I highly recommend it. This is a proper peer-reviewed academic study. So it's not just crazy Jehovah's Witness stuff. I don't even think the author is a Jehovah's Witness. But it's an actual serious study. And I did a blog on it where I analyzed what this book argues and what's in it and stuff. I have a footnote in my book on the historicity of Jesus where I said I suspected the things that author proves, right? And so I was so glad to find that book. I was like, oh my gosh, this book proves everything that I suspected was the case. They're not confident in their conclusions, but they do have a strong suspicion that it was a secret teaching already in the earliest times of Christianity that Michael was Jesus. Jesus is secretly the angel Michael, and has always been, and that's just a secret that you want to not leak out, but it leaks out later eventually, right? But this comes from Daniel, where there's Daniel 9 and Daniel 12 have timelines in them that line up in such a way that suggests that Michael is the Christ who gets crucified, or Christ who gets killed in Daniel 9. And so whether that's what the authors of Daniel meant or not doesn't matter. What matters is it's easy for someone who's looking for secret messages in the Bible to think that's what Daniel said, right? So you can easily show that this is where, some crazy Bible code Christian is reading, oh my God, Daniel is Michael. And then they're the whole Christianity gets invented just on that. It's easy to see how that would happen. Obviously we don't know that's what happened. We don't have access to the secret rooms and we didn't bug their offices or anything. So we don't know what this moment was or if it happened, but there's a lot of clues to it having been the case. And it's a thing I couldn't prove. And so I just throw it in a footnote as something I suspect, but I don't know if it's true, on the history of Jesus. But that book by that author, I think really strongly argues, strongly enough for my sake, for my interest, that this is more than a speculation, that I think we have actual it's not certain, but we have evidence that it is the case, that Michael was the actual original angelic name of Jesus. But that's a side note. And again, that's a whole digression. We could argue about it and stuff. If someone wants to, no, it can't be the case. It's okay, well, let's have an argument. There's pros and cons, I understand. And so one can argue that, but there's evidence for this. It's not just something that Jehovah's Witnesses made up. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Well, now, one of the criticisms that I generally get whenever somebody presents me with these kinds of poor arguments is that they basically kick a rock and they say, well, you've just got an answer for everything, don't you? And, to that, I generally respond with, yeah, fuck me and my explanatory power.
Yeah, because I checked shit. Right. I checked. That's why I have an answer to everything. Occasionally I don't. Someone will occasionally, very rarely, someone will surprise me of something I've never encountered before. And I'll go, oh, I've never heard that. I'll have to look into that. But almost never, because I've spent years and years studying this. So I've heard all the arguments. None of this is new, right? And when I hear them, I check. I go check the literature, I check the sources. And so then I know, right? And that's how I know all of this stuff, right? So when people say well, you have an answer for everything, it's yeah, because I checked. If you checked, you'd have an answer for everything too, right? So why aren't you checking? That's the question I always have. It's why did you just come up with this from the armchair? Like you said, they just kick over a rock and just make something up. And I was but okay, that's a great way to come up with hypotheses. Are you doing anything to test these hypotheses before you go declaring them, right? So the McGrath argument that you just made before we get to the next part, that's an interesting hypothesis. You say oh, angels usually have L names. I wonder if it's the case. I'm going to hypothesize that they were only ever given L names. And then that would be an argument against this. But I should check, right? Like, is that true? And of course, if they check, they find out it's not. They, oh, well, that hypothesis is dumb. I'll get rid of it. And so the thing that annoys me is that they don't check. And I don't understand why. Like, McGrath has the training. He knows how to check. Like, he's been taught to check. Why doesn't he check? Like, and he's not the only one who does this. Like, a lot of scholars do this, and it's very vexing. It's like, just check. Like, rather than just turn your hypothesis into a fact miraculously from the armchair. Like, it's an interesting hypothesis. It might be correct. Like, yeah, maybe that's the case that angels are only given L names. But you have to check it then. It's got to go from hypothesis to fact. You have to go check it. And that hypothesis will fail tests, right? Because you'll very quickly find out that it's not true, and so you have to get rid of it. But the thing that annoys me the most is that they aren't checking, and so I would like to see more people do that. And I know you do that. It's like you even do that to me, which I love, right? It's like rather than just trust me, you check things, and it's like, yeah, fuck yeah, please do that. That's how you find out. And so yeah, it's the thing.
Yeah, and I mean, you learn so much by doing that, because then, you know, you're following citations and you're reading what the person actually said, because that's actually one of the criticisms that I've heard levied at you is that, oh, well, he misuses or he abuses that particular like scholar or that reference or something like that. And so I'm like, oh, well, does he? And so like I find your reference, I go and I have so like KC just the other day was like, I wish people could see your Kindle library. Thank you. Because I, you know, in researching all of this or reading, just simply reading like your blogs and books and everything, I've had to buy so many like tangential books to the topic to do these fact checking things. I too wish that people would do that. But my next question before we get to the rest of McGrath's answer is, do you, because this has been kind of insinuated in my direction before, do you find that being able to explain the criticisms made of the minimal mythicist position, do you think that being able to explain why those criticisms are unfounded is a mark of like ad hocness, or just, you know, because that's typically what's insinuated by the question of, well, you just got an answer for everything, don't you? It's like, well, it's an insinuation of like, oh, you're just ad hoc claiming that this isn't a problem.
It's based on the fact that all lies are built to sound like truths. So apologetics is specifically engineered to sound like valid methodologies, right? So saying, like, the example I give is William Lane Craig in the Kalam cosmological argument. They use standard syllogistic argument, you know, standard deductive logic, but then they put bullshit premises in it, and then claim, look, logic. And you know so it looks exactly like a valid argument, because it's valid in the sense that, you know, the logic is valid, but the premises are bogus. But he like does all this hand waving to make you think that somehow the premises are logically necessarily true, and therefore the conclusion is. But the fact that he misuses and abuses logic, that he cons people with a bogus use of formal logic, is not an argument against formal logic. Like, you can say formal logic is bullshit because look what you can do with it. It's like, no, that's not a valid conclusion. The formal logic works great. It's totally reliable as long as you use it correctly, right? And so what's happening is he's not using it correctly. The same goes with Bayesian arguments, like bogus Bayesian arguments. It's not a problem with Bayes. It's not a problem with Bayes' theorem. It's a problem with the bullshit ways that people misuse it. And so if you use it correctly, like, that's not the case. So what you're talking about is like when you have, like, when I've done the angel thing, I've done all the research on this. I know there are tons of angels, and that there aren't named with L. And I know there are angel names that don't end that way. I know Philo himself is saying that this angel is anatole. I know he talks about the logos. Logos is not an L name. So I know that. I already know it because I checked. And so when I come up with that immediately, it's because I checked and I know this argument already. And so I go in, say, oh, but you have an answer for everything. It's like, yeah, that's because I did proper research and I'm telling you facts that contradict the thing. But an apologist who makes stuff up from the armchair, like McGrath essentially just did, like, he's getting it from Hurtado, but I think Hurtado is armchair on that one too, because he clearly didn't check either. But still, he's just believing Hurtado. He didn't check Hurtado, like, he just trusted him. And so, but that looks exactly the same. It looks like he has an answer for everything. Like, he's asked this weird, obscure question. He suddenly has an answer. Sounds like a good answer, right? So someone who doesn't know anything about it. But the difference between that is that he's just making shit up, whereas I've actually checked the facts. And so my answer is responding by telling you the actual facts that I found when I checked. And whereas, but they look the same, right? So McGrath's claim looks like someone who checked and thus knows what he's talking about, right? Like he gives that air. The way he answered is like people, oh, he must have checked, right? But he didn't, right? But it looks the same. That's the thing, is it looks the same. So when people say like, oh, let's look at that, that's just like apologetics. And it's like, yeah, the apologetics is designed to look the same as legitimate argument. And so the fact that they look the same doesn't tell you that legitimate argument is bogus. You have to go behind the argument and fact check it to see who's bullshitting and who's not. And so that idea, like you have an answer for everything, is a fallacy in the sense that it's assuming that you're being apologetical. You might be, but you can't assume that, right? Because it looks the same. And so to tell the difference, you have to actually go check to see, oh, is he just making the answers up at the drop of a hat to make things go away, which apologists do all the time? Or does he have a point? Like, is his argument actually based on actual reality? So you do have to check those things. So people who just assume that because it looks like apologetics that therefore it is, they're arguing fallaciously. And that's a problem in general. That's a broad problem, because it means if they're doing it to you, they're doing it to all sorts of things that they don't like. And so this is a bad epistemology. Like, they need to fix it stat, right? Because it's going to be leading to them to all kinds of false conclusions if they keep acting this way. It's that relying on that fallacy is bad. And I don't think people should have that in their repertoire.
I completely agree with that. Let's now that I've tried to present like at least reasonable pushback against everything.
For sure. Good questions. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. He's going to say something, I feel, Rick, here in a minute, that's going to make you laugh hysterically.
I'm already laughing. I haven't even heard it yet.
Yeah, I know, but trust me, the irony is palpable at this point.
Bart Ehrman, after his book came out, was on the panel about that. And there's the word that we render as angel means messenger, right? And so the question of whether Paul, in saying you received me as a messenger of God, as Christ himself, means messenger in the angelic sense, or as somebody sent by God, and is not saying that, is one that I think he'd be willing to say there's at least some ambiguity there.
So technically, you and Bart obviously don't see eye to eye. When I've listened to him, how Jesus became God, or his lectures he's done, his books, he is always going to Philippians 2 and seeing that and saying, oh yeah, pre-existent, going from heaven, coming down, becoming a man. And your interpretation, I think, is similar more to what I hear James Tabor describe and others.
Yeah. So on the one hand,
so there was a long sort of diatribe there. I just wanted to explain why. There's just a long explanation there of some stuff that is not really pertinent to the angel discussion. But if I remember correctly, is that one of the positions that Dr. Ehrman has flipped on? This idea of like Jesus being divine and then
right. Ehrman's not, and I'm not, like none of us are arguing that the Trinitarianism existed in Paul. Like they're not saying like they're identical. But the idea of Jesus being a pre-existent being, yes, that is Ehrman's new position. People might not realize, this is another thing where McGrath is not giving context. So people might not know what McGrath is talking about here. So there's a verse in Galatians where Paul says, you received me as Christ, as an angel of God, right? And Ehrman has done an announcement. Now, Ehrman is not the first to do this. He read other people who did this, or other scholars in peer-reviewed literature who did this before him. But he checked the literature and he was convinced by this argument, and I think he should be. And in fact, I did not count on this argument myself. I was like McGrath. I was like, well, it's a little ambiguous. But when I read Ehrman's explication of why what McGrath just said is not a valid argument, I was convinced. So Ehrman actually convinced me of this, that passage is evidence that Paul thought that Jesus was an angel in some sense. And I don't think that stands by itself, right? It's just one piece of evidence. You need more evidence to pull that all together. but it's stronger evidence than I had previously thought. And Ehrman has a response to, I think he's got a blog. Like, I think you check on his blog. He and Hurtado got in on this a lot. And now Hurtado actually agrees with the pre-existent being thing. He just doesn't like the word angel. So they're arguing about, does the word angel apply? And so Hurtado doesn't like this passage because it would allow that he's false. So because Paul's calling Christ an angel. Christ can't be called an angel. That just can't be. Even though he's a pre-existent being, he's not an angel. He's some other thing we don't have a word for, apparently. So they argued about this. And so this McGrath's argument came up in that argument. And so you can find on Ehrman's blog, you can find his article on this. One or two, actually. It might be more than one. I find Ehrman's arguments completely convincing on this, like his grammatical point and all of that. And like I said, he didn't come up with these things himself, but he's right to be convinced by them. I'm not exactly sure where he got them. So it's possible it was in some of the works that I looked at and I just overlooked it, but he's the best articulator of it. He makes it very clear and cuts it down to the simple, just the core facts of the grammar, what's going on. And he makes it very clear. And so it's a really good argument. So I actually agree with Ehrman on that. And that's what McGrath is talking about. And he's just saying he's not convinced by that. But of course, the whole argument doesn't hinge on this one passage, right? There's a lot of other evidence for this. And then there's also the question is, where is McGrath? Is he with Hurtado? And he agrees that Jesus was a pre-existent being, but he just wasn't called an angel. Like, is it a semantic argument? Or is McGrath with like Dunn, who's like trying to reinterpret everything so that, no, it's not a pre-existent being. It's pre-existent being. It's something else. It's some sort of metaphor or something. Or Jesus was an idea in the mind of God or something like that. So it's not clear which position McGrath says, because I think McGrath is answering the question and he's not being conscious of the fact that audience doesn't know the context of anything he's talking about. I do that sometimes too, so I can't overly criticize him for that. But that, because that's going on, I think some of the audience here right now might not know what he's talking about, but that's what he's talking about. And it's that grammatical debate about what does the grammar mean of that one passage in Galatians, where Paul seems to call Jesus an angel. And McGrath's position is that he's just saying a messenger of God. He's not saying an actual angel.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's see where he goes with this, though. So we left off, there was a cut, and it was just some side tangential thing that was being discussed, and I wanted to list a little bit of brevity on this section.
Yeah, let's cut to our subject. We're talking about angels.
Right.
I had to come down, and I recognize there's ambiguity, and I will confess that I'm uncertain and open to being convinced, and not even so much open to being convinced, it's just really not certain, right? There's some ambiguity there at the beginning, but I'm admittedly influenced by my mentor. James Dunn wrote his Christology in the Making and made a strong case for the Adam background, and I definitely think that's there, regardless of whether there's a pre-existent status at the beginning. There's certainly room for instance, a pre-existent Messiah in Judaism, and so pre-existence doesn't mean divinity, and it can, right? The two can go hand in hand, but they don't have to. And so I think the question of whether there's pre-existence language needs to be separated from the question of whether Jesus is an angelic or divine figure. The status that Jesus is exalted to at the end is not the status he had at the beginning. That's right. Therefore, because he was obedient, God super exalted him, hyper exalted him, gave him the name which he didn't have before, that is above every name. So bestows on him the divine name, so that then he essentially becomes the means to sort of divine universal rule, right, as this exalted figure who's been installed above all these other powers. And so I think that's the key thing, is that whatever the starting point is, and whether or not it involves pre-existence, this is the story of a person who is being compared and contrasted with Adam, obeys where Adam disobeyed, and so where Adam loses his in the image and likeness of God status with everything that came with it, at least to some extent, Jesus supposedly, in Paul's theology, gets that back by being obedient.
So,
what do you think about that entire? I noticed you nodding.
Gosh,
so
there was a bunch of things in there. Oh man, so 3 things. Let's see. He ended with the Adam.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you can tell me
trying
to
to-
stop at whatever single.
Yeah. I was
whatever
going
point
to,
you
but I
want
wanted to hear him complete his
Right.
thoughts, but he didn't go where I wanted to know. So, for example, when he said that he was assigned the name above all names, I was hoping he would tell me what he thinks that name is. That would have been
Yeah.
interesting. I want to know what McGrath thinks that name is, because there's a debate about this. Like, was the name Jesus, for example? Is that the name above all names? And this seems to be the case in later Christian literature, where it's the name of Jesus that is the name that scares all the demons and makes exorcism work, for example. So it suggests that he wasn't named Jesus in life, that Jesus is a name that was assigned to him after his resurrection. Now, that doesn't tell you whether he existed or not, because it could have been, Joe Blow, it could have been Matthias and gets killed, and then now you're Jesus because, etc. Like that. That's totally compatible with historicity. But I would be curious to know what McGrath thinks the name above all names is. I waffle on this. Like, it looks like it's Jesus. Like when you read the text, it's like, is it Jesus? It looks like they're talking about Jesus being the name above all names. But I don't know for sure, because you could say, well, is it the Lord? Is the Lord the name above all names? Is it a secret name that we're not being told? So I'm not entirely sure on that one. I kind of lean towards it's Jesus, but it's not strong enough for me to say that that's what's going on there. So that's an example. I was waiting for him to finish that sentence. He didn't. So I didn't want to interrupt. But yeah, he went on to talk about a bunch of other things. Two other things. One thing before that and one thing after that. The thing before that is he says that whether Jesus was a pre-existent being is a different question from whether he was divine, which is a different question from whether that's an angel. All three of these things are different things. So angel doesn't necessarily mean God. Doesn't necessarily mean divine. It depends on what your definition of divine is. Pre-existent, this is the Hurtado argument. He's a pre-existent divine being, but he's not called an angel. That's offensive or something or whatever. So that's a semantic argument. And again, McGrath didn't parse that, so I don't know where he lands on that. He seems to say that he's not sure, right? He's saying, like, I don't know, like these are different questions. I don't know how to answer them, which is a fair answer, right? But I agree with him that these are three completely different things, and it depends on semantics. Like, how are you defining these words? What do you mean when you say that Jesus can't be called an angel? What is that, like? Why? Based on what? Like, what definition are you giving of angel that it doesn't apply, etc. So there's a lot of different arguments you can spin on that, and McGrath didn't take a position, so there's nothing really to respond to on that. And then there's the other half, which is the Adam comparison. It seemed like to me that McGrath thinks that Philippians 2 is comparing Jesus to Adam. And I think that's false. I think it's more obvious that Jesus is compared to Satan, right? Jesus is reversing Satan. Now, he's not reversing Adam. He's reversing Satan, because when you look at Philippians 2, verse 5, for instance, it's like he didn't claim equality to God. He submitted, right? That is a direct reference to Satan, who claimed that he's as good as God, causing the war in heaven, and then Satan and his legion of angels are cast down. And that caused death and every other evil thing in Second Temple theology. That was all caused by Satan trying to claim the status of God. Jesus does the opposite. He's just as powerful as Satan. He could try to do what Satan did, but no, he does the opposite. He humbles himself. He gives up all the supernatural powers, becomes mortal, and then gets killed, and then he gets exalted because he obeyed. So he obeyed. He went down and obeyed. Satan disobeyed and was cast down, right? So like he's undoing the story of Satan. So I think it's Satan, not Adam. Adam didn't try to pretend that he was God. Like, that's not in the story. Adam just like fucked up because he was a dumbass, right? Like there's no like I'm equal to God, right? No, he just made a mistake and then God punished him for it, right? There's nothing about Adam trying to claim equality to God. Only Satan does that. And that is a Second Temple teaching that is not in the Bible. You won't find that in the Old Testament that we have now. It was in Jewish scriptures, but not the ones that ended up in our Old Testament. So but I understand where he thinks like Jesus is reversing Adam. Like there are legitimate ways to think that would be a metaphor that people would use. So I'm not going to criticize McGrath too much on that. But the only reason I disagree with that is because I think when you analyze the passage, it's very clearly referring to Satan. Jesus is reversing Satan, not Adam. That's connected to Adam in Second Temple theology. Adam, they connected to the serpent, etc. That was not the case in the Old Testament. That's a later development. The idea that they're the same. is a different thing. But anyway, those are the only three things that McGrath said. I didn't find them like laughable. They're so
No. The
disagree with
laughable parts, I believe, still to come, or
Oh.
might add, the really laughable part.
Oh dear. Okay.
Comes in a different video, so he's just got a couple more minutes to go. I
Let's
may
do
have
it.
been wrong as to when the laughable part happens. So
Let's find out.
all right.
This is how you test a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Yes or no question, really simple. Could you be wrong?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to ask because sometimes it's good to let our audience follow us, right? So
I'll say, can I go even further?
Yeah,
I am wrong. I don't know about what, but for sure. And when I'm wrong and I'm persuaded of that, I try to change my mind. But pretty much guarantee that as a human being and even as an expert in certain areas, I'm wrong. Right? Because people that I respect hold different viewpoints. And the odds are that some of them are right about some of the things that I and they disagree on. Right? And so that's one of the things that I think in the ideal world, not always in practice, distinguishes scholarship from the kind of internet apologetics.
Yeah.
Is that, ideally we're searching for truth and we are trying to get closer to it. And we're fallible. And that's why we need this community of people who are going to challenge our ideas. Sorry for taking that one word answer. And
that's a great answer. I really like that. I'll do it in Bayesian terms. Like if I am 99% certain of something, that means there's a 1% chance I'm wrong, which means of all those beliefs that I'm that confident in, 1 out of every 100 of them, I have to be wrong and not know it. So I know I've got to be wrong by about at least 1% of the things that I believe. And some things less, because some things I'm more confident in than 99%. But other things I'm less confident. So when I do the top margin of my margin of error on the historicity of Jesus, I give 33%, right? It's a 1 in 3 chance I'm wrong. Like I'm admitting to a lot of possibility of being wrong in that. And even on the bottom margin of my error, where I'm 1 in 12,000, still 1 in 12,000. Like there's a chance I'm wrong. It's just I'm less likely. If that's the probability, then it's very unlikely that I'm wrong. It's possible. And in fact, that means 1 out of every 12,000 things that I have that much evidence for, I'm wrong about. And so that has to be a fact. And so the goal there, because that's a fact, your goal should always be self-monitoring, always checking, right? Like always like wanting to listen to like a sincere, non-disingenuous argument against what you're thinking, because they could be right. And that's the only way. That's how I ended up a mythicist, right? It's like I was an adamant like historicist, making fun of mythicists until I checked, right? I spent 6 years checking it. And I actually, I could count it like before that when I looked at Earl Doherty's book, and I wasn't completely convinced, but I realized like he had a decent argument, and I didn't think that was even possible. That started my change, right? It's like when I realized that you could actually make a decent argument against the historicity of Jesus, which I didn't think was possible. That changed. I realized I was wrong all the time. The same thing happened with Q. I used to be yeah, Q, of course. Until I checked the facts for Q, and I was like, oh my God, these arguments are terrible. The evidence, there's tons of evidence against it. Like there's no basis for Q. That was a transformation. I was on the other side of that. I was on the other side of like Mark is like a terrible writer, or he writes like a hick. And then I studied Mark and realized, no, he's a freaking genius. And he knows he's writing in a low dialect on purpose, right? Like it's like Mark Twain. He's doing this on purpose. That was a flip. So it's like, you can be wrong about tons of things, and it really does hinge on whether you've checked or not. Like that makes a big difference as to whether the probability that you're going to be right or wrong about something.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that actually wasn't the funny part that I was thinking about. It's
I didn't think it was. Yeah, no, right.
It's definitely it's definitely in the second video. And maybe we'll be able to get to that. But so that was the end of his response. It was a very basic sort of response to it. And like you pointed out, it's the Hurtado argument against the Philo's angel kind of thing. But next we've got Chrissy Hansen, who got a super chat to explain why you're wrong about Philo's Archangel.
Nice.
For some reason, like this has been across the spectrum
lately.
of like
right.
people.
It's been weird. Right.
Yeah. So we're gonna head on over to there real quick as soon as I can get this shared. Right there. Okay, so this is Jacob Berman interviewing Chrissy Hansen, and they're going to go over a super chat, and we'll just go from there.
Okay.
I want to come back to that in a moment, but we have a super chat from Camel Gregor. Thank you for your super chat, Camel. He says, "Hi, Carrier's current goalpost shift re-Philo is that Philo doesn't explicitly say that the Logos is named Jesus, but we can still infer he believed that. Can you please explain how this doesn't follow?"
Yeah, so sorry, I wanted to stop this right here just because the only part that I kind of, disagree with in this question is a goalpost shift. Like I don't,
Yeah,
from an outside perspective, like I haven't seen a goalpost shift because I've read the actual argument and everything, and so
I have a screen cap from my book. I just have to see if I can get it up. Okay, hang on, let me find it because it's not letting me open these things. Yeah, so because this is a common thing that people are claiming. This is an example of what I'm talking about. Is like in my book, I'm very clear on this. I don't understand why people are not just reading the book. And so let me find it. Here we go. Here it is. Okay, so
my wife said that would take effort, Rick.
Yeah. Don't get me flaming out on this because I really do find it frustrating. It is very frustrating. Here we go. So I'm going to throw it into Facebook, message to you. And this is actually just a screen cap from my book on the historicity of Jesus, and bring it up because I think it's right. Hold on. Yeah, it should be the right one.
Don't mind my AI angel images down there. Those are the PG ones that I was able to make. But anyways, all right. So there you go.
By the way, the for people, if there are any women who are watching this and you want to know how, here's a hack. If you want to know how to tell an AI to make heroic pictures of you that don't over sexualize you, just tell it you're a man. give it all the same info, the same pictures, the source picture, everything, but just say you're a man, and it will come up with awesome photos of you that don't over sexualize you. And that's I find very fascinating. But anyway,
that's cool.
Yeah, because you tell it like do an angel based on this, but the source image is a woman, but you tell it that it's a man. It will do a proper female figure. But it will make it look awesome, right? It won't just like make it naked or
So interesting that you bring this up right now because earlier I typed in let me see if I can get the exact wordage because I tweeted about this. I don't expect anybody to read my tweets or anything like that, but
I boosted a Facebook because there was a woman who figured this out and she gave examples. They were awesome examples. So it's on my Facebook wall, but like a million posts ago. So finding it, I'm not going to even try right now. But there was someone who did this and wrote an article about it, and it was really interesting what she wrote. Anyway, so it's an interesting, bizarre AI world life hack.
Yeah. So I typed into this AI generator, which the generator I picked, you can either do art or you can do photos. So they'll do like realistic kind of photos type thing. Right. But I was in photos because I was wondering what it would give me. And so the literal thing, just so that people don't think like I'm a pervert or something, I typed in Archangel parting the clouds bathed in light. Okay.
Yeah.
That got me like a Pacific Islander looking woman topless with her titties out and in like the sun.
Yeah, see, that's
and
the
I'm
thing.
like, I did not ask for this.
There was nothing sexual in your prompt, but it just assumes because it's based on the internet, so it's getting its sexism from our culture. One of the most useful things about AI is that if you want to discern something that's about our culture that we don't want to admit is true, just ask AI and it will show us. of what's wrong with our culture. But yeah, that's the case. Anyway, back to what we're looking at. So this is from my book. And so it's a thing where I say some doubt whether Philo knew he was quoting Zechariah. That's a different argument. Or was speaking of the figure there named Jesus. But such doubts are unwarranted. The sentence in Zechariah in the Greek, and I go through the whole argument. So there's no goalpost moved here. Like, I'm outright admitting that Philo does not say the angel is named Jesus. I'm saying, like, some can doubt it. And so I'm just saying the doubts are unwarranted, and here's why. And then I give an argument. I give an argument for why I think Philo thinks that the Jesus figure in this passage is the one in the passage of Zechariah. So what's here is not the Zechariah passage. What's here is the Philo passage. Because all he gives is the one line that's in bold here, which is, behold, the man whose name is rising. And then he goes on and on about that. So the question is, like, well, who's the man whose name is rising in Zechariah 6? Right. So that's where there's a debate. And I point out that, yeah, you can debate this. Some doubt it. It's obvious. I'm admitting that the passage doesn't say that it's Jesus. And I give an evidence for why I think it's Jesus. I think the evidence is good. And the basic gist of it is, and that's, you can see it here about the coincidence argument, is that Philo says that this name, Anatole, is, and it's not in this passage, but if you go look at the full Philo passage, he goes on to say that, no, this is the Zechariah passage. Okay, yeah, you're looking at the Zechariah passage. The one in bold is the only part that Philo quotes. Let's see, the coincidence argument. Let me put that in the Facebook. So you can bring up the coincidence argument. I don't know if this is from the book or not. Yeah, that's from the book. So I just sent that to you in Facebook. Yes, because, so if you read the Zechariah passage, which is there on the screen, if you just read it straightforward, you say, well, it looks like Jesus is the one, Joshua is the one being called this. But there's lots of ways to dispute this. It's not many scholars under peer review agree with me that it is Jesus that Zechariah was understood to be referring to, even though we all agree that that's not what Zechariah originally wrote. This is another thing that complicates this argument, is that we're talking about the passage that as it existed when Philo was reading it, and everybody agrees that that is not what Zechariah wrote. So the original Zechariah said something different. We don't have it. It's been corrupted. And we know this because of various manuscript evidence and translation evidence, the discrepancy between the Hebrew and the Septuagint and so on. But in the time of Philo, all the other stuff was gone. So it looks like it's Jesus. So the argument that I give is what you see here. This is from the book again. So this is not goalpost moving. This is the argument. This is it. That Philo says that the Anatole, the name is wisely given, like it's appropriately given to this entity, whoever he thinks the entity is, he doesn't say, is appropriately given because it's referring to God's firstborn son, and it's the firstborn son who is the one who created the universe. He goes on and says all that. And now we know who this is, the firstborn son who created the universe. Philo talks about him all the time. He talks about him again in the same book. It's the Logos, the Archangel of many names, who's also the high priest of God's celestial temple. Now, there's two things about the Zechariah passage. Joshua ben Jehozadak. Jehozadak ben Jehozadak means son of God the righteous. So we have Jesus, son of God the righteous, and he's identified as the high priest. The Logos Archangel that Philo thinks this is talking about is the high priest of God's celestial temple and the firstborn son of God. What are the odds that Philo knows that there's a guy in this passage called the high priest and son of God, but he doesn't mean that's the high priest and son of God that he's talking about, right? Like, the probability of that is so low. Like, the coincidence would be bizarre. It would be bizarre for him not even to comment on this. Like, oh gosh, I don't mean Jesus. I don't mean the son of God high priest named Jesus. I mean somebody else. Like, no, he knows there's only one person in this passage who's called the high priest and the son of God. And he says Anatole is correctly naming this guy because he's the son of God and he's the one who created the universe. When you put all that together, it's obvious that Philo thinks that the person who's being called Anatole is Jesus in the passage. It doesn't matter what Zechariah thought. It doesn't matter what anybody else interpret. This is what Philo is saying. right? So Philo clearly thinks the character he's talking about is Jesus, right? So he thinks that Jesus is the correct name as one of the names of this angel. He's not interested in that. He's interested in the Natale name, like he's talking about this other name. That's the only name he's curious about at this particular point. So he doesn't go into it. But you can infer quite clearly that he understands that Jesus is the one that he's talking about. Yeah, you can argue about, oh, Philo misread the verse or whatever. That's fine, but that's not relevant to what we're talking about here, which is that we're talking about what does Philo think? Philo thinks it's Jesus. And so anyway, I give that argument, and I talk about it being like it's highly improbable that that would be a coincidence. Therefore, the most probable explanation is that this is what Philo thinks. So the fact that that's an argument I give, and I say that you can doubt it, and I show the fact that he doesn't say Jesus, and he only references the passages by referring to the Natale name, etc. There's no goalpost moving. This has always been my argument. Always. From the beginning. I didn't change it. I didn't like backtrack. I didn't do it. This has always been my argument. And for people to like, they get the argument wrong, attribute that fake argument to me. And then when I explain the actual original argument, they say I'm backtracking and moving the goalposts. It's like, no. You fucked up. You've completely misstated what my argument was. And because you're attributing that false argument to me that I never made, now you think that I am backtracking and moving the goalposts. No, this has always been my argument. And the thing that pisses me off is that you don't know that. That's the thing that I find really annoying by all of these people. Won't you just fucking read the original damn text and get my argument right? If you're going to criticize it, like, get it right, you know? Anyway, so that's my, brief rant about that.
Well, yeah. So I wanted to run something by you because, I've also been arguing about this particular topic for a bit and, pointing some things out to people. And, in my most recent discussion with somebody that was quite incoherent,
Yeah.
I started looking a bit deeper into this. And I think that the way that I read this, and tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm reading this or I have the wrong concept here, but it seems like in the 62 and 63, Philo is saying that it would be strange to call like the human high priest in the Zechariah passage.
Yes.
It would be strange to call him a Natale. But if you reinterpret this to be talking about the incorporeal logos that is the divine image, this archangel that he's been talking about, then it actually makes more sense. So because that's one thing that Neil said in your discussion with him, is that we know that Philo is not doing that here, or that Philo doesn't explicitly say that he's doing that here. But when I read this, I'm like, he's explicitly saying that he's reinterpreting this passage.
Correct.
To be about, not a human person on earth, but about this incorporeal being.
Yeah, he's giving what we call a completely wackadoo interpretation of Zechariah 6, verse 12. Mm-hmm. It's wackadoo. It's not at all what Zechariah said. It's probably not what most people back then thought it said. But it's clear that Philo thinks that, oh no, this can't be the human Jesus. It has to be this weird archangel that I believe in, right? So, and he's clearly not alone, because when he talks about this archangel, he talks about it in a way that suggests that this is a popular belief. It's not just some thing that he has to argue is like, well, I'm this weirdo who believes in this angel and nobody else does. No, he clearly assumes that everybody agrees that this angel exists, and he does that throughout many books when he talks about it. Now, the dispute, though, to be fair, and it is a struggle to be fair here, but to be fair, the dispute is which man Zechariah, which man Philo thinks Zechariah is calling a Natale. Now, in the current verse, and in the verse as he had it, which both the Hebrew and the Greek, but especially the Hebrew, the Greek has something weird in the next line that could call this into question, but in the next passage. But in this passage, even in the Greek, but also in the Hebrew, Jesus is the only figure in the passage. So there's only one person to be called a Natale, and that's Jesus. Now, what's often argued is that something has dropped out of the verse. And we can get this from the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew. The Hebrews lost this, but in the Septuagint, it says in the next verse, it talks about there being two people, a priest and a king, and the king is Zerubbabel, right? And so Zerubbabel has what scholars suspect is that Zechariah originally wrote Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel is the one that's being called the Anatole, and it's the king rather than the priest that's being called that. And that's a plausible argument. I think it's entirely possible. But that's gone by the time Philo is looking at the text. So there's no Zerubbabel in the passage that he's talking about at this time. And so you have to infer that that's what Zechariah originally meant. It's clear Philo doesn't think that. To me, anyway, it's clear that Philo. But you can say, like, well, maybe Philo figured it out, that it's actually referring to Zerubbabel is the Anatole. And then that's, if you're going to make that argument, I don't think that holds up. But it doesn't change the point that you made, which is that, well, okay, let's assume that it's Zerubbabel. So that gets rid of the name. It's not Jesus, it's Zerubbabel. It's still, he's reinterpreting Zerubbabel as the supernatural creator being, right? And so that's still the case. He's saying that, oh, this passage isn't really about the human Zerubbabel. It's actually a secret hidden message about this divine super being that I talk about a lot. That's true, and that's indisputable. I don't think anybody can honestly dispute that that's what Philo is talking about. And you can see that here when it says it's the strangest of titles if you're talking about a human, which is a soul and body combined. So it can't be immortal. So Philo has dismissed Zerubbabel being immortal or Jesus being immortal, depending on who he means. I think it's Jesus, but he's dismissed that it's immortal, that somehow Zechariah is secretly talking about a super agent, God's super angel. He says, it's the incorporeal one. So it's not a fleshly being who's identical to the divine image. We know who that is. Philo talks about that entity a lot. And it truly describes him because he's the eldest son, whom the Father raised up, and elsewhere calls the firstborn. We know Philo talks about this. It's the same angel. And indeed, the Son thus begotten followed the ways of his Father. And it says here, and shaped the different kinds, looking to the archetypal patterns which that Father supplied. It's a bit clunky. If you look at the Greek, what it means is he created everything based on the models that God gave him. So that last line means that we're talking about a creator being. He's talking about the being that created the universe, created everything, planets, stars, the earth, plants, animals, created all the things. And so obviously, first of all, this is a person. It's not some abstract concept. It's not the son or progeny of a historical priest or king. It's not an actual priest or king. Philo clearly means that this is some alien super being that is being referred to here. And yeah, that's wackadoo. That's not what Zechariah ever meant, but it is clearly what Philo thinks he meant. And that's what's relevant, right? Is he's saying that I think, and he must mean other people like him think, that this is a secret hidden message about this super being. And so that's the case. And it's an angel. He doesn't say the word angel here, but we know all these attributes he identifies as the Archangel of many names. He explicitly says Archangel. He explicitly says Archangel of many names. So we know he means this is an angel. And so that's what I'm talking about here. Now, then you get to the question of, behold the man. Is that Jesus or is that Zerubbabel in Zechariah? What did Philo think? And that's different from what Zechariah meant, because those are different things. And even different, not just what Zechariah meant, but what other Jews thought Zechariah meant. They might all disagree, right, about what Zechariah meant. There might be different exegesis of this text. All we can get at from here is what Philo thought. And I think the evidence is very clear. He thinks whoever is called Anatole there is a son of God and high priest. And there's only one person who's named Son of God and High Priest in that verse, and that's Jesus. And so that's my argument. It's always been my argument, and it is almost always ignored. Neil Sendelak just ignores the argument, never responds to it. It seems like Camille Gregor ignores the argument, never responds to it. No one will actually read the book and respond to my actual argument, but that's my actual argument.
Yeah. Oh, Carrier, he goes farther than that now. Neil has progressed even farther than that to claim that you have no evidence.
Yeah, right. And for the audience, I've just presented the evidence. So there is at least evidence. You can't say there's no evidence. You could say the evidence is inadequate. I don't think it is, but you could at least say that, okay, there's evidence, but it's not sufficient. But to say there's no evidence whatsoever is literally ignoring the entire argument. But yeah.
Right. All right. Well, let's see how Chrissy handles this.
Right.
So let's get to
probably going to focus on the name. That would be my best.
My guess would be focusing on the name because that's what everybody's been focused on.
Yeah.
So I'm just I'm kind of curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is.
So I did write a paper on this in the Journal of History.
Pause this for a moment.
Essentially,
for the audience, I wrote a response to that paper, so you can find that on my blog if you're interested in deep diving this. But continue.
Yeah, I will. I'll try to find that because I know I've got it in my history.
Yeah, and
'cause I
the
remember
name,
reading it.
her name isn't up, but it's Chrissy Hansen. Just look for
Right.
Hansen. That's En Hansen on my website, and Pre-Existent. Those two keywords will find the article on my blog.
we can't infer that this is what Philo meant. It's very specifically because Philo doesn't give any indicators that this is what he meant. He only cites that, behold, there comes a man whose name is Rising, which is, and he's very specifically looking for the word Anatole, and he's looking for it everywhere and anywhere. So he also goes and finds it in Genesis as well. In the previous section, he doesn't care who it referred to originally. It just doesn't matter. Now, Carrier's argument is partially based on the idea that this Anatole, this rising figure, is Joshua, the high priest. But that doesn't make sense, because if you actually go to the next verse, this is Zechariah.
Yeah, so I got to stop it right here because this has been a trope that has been played out through all this. It's like, ignore the part that Philo cites, Zechariah 6:12 in. Let's actually shift and look to the verses after that where he's not talking about the same figure, and let's look at that. It's like, oh, hey, look at this red car over here kind of situation there.
Yeah, I'll say something about that after we finish the clip, but yeah, I have comments.
Zechariah 6, Zechariah chapter 6, verse 13. It very specifically says that there will be a peace between this rising figure, the king, and the priest will be at his right hand. There will be a peace between them both. And he uses
just a bit of foreshadowing.
Both.
What Chrissy is saying is false, but true in a relevant sense, which we'll get to. But she's confusing two different texts, but we'll get to that. But proceed.
Okay.
and a conjunction. It in the Greek, it very clearly is talking about two different figures, and because the rising figure is the king and the priest is at his right hand, it means that this is not about Joshua. Joshua is at the right hand of this king figure, and in the rest of Zechariah, this king figure is Zerubbabel.
Yes, that's the Zerubbabel argument.
Yeah. Did you want to say anything right now?
Yeah, we can go into that. So the whole so first she says there's no indicators. There are. He says that it's aptly named because it's the firstborn son of God. There's only one son of God. Zerubbabel is not called Ben Jehozadak. Well, the only Ben Jehozadak is Jesus. So that is an indicator. We also know that Philo thinks that this angel is the high priest of God's celestial temple. There's only one high priest in the verse. So those are two indicators that Philo thinks Jesus is the one being referred to. And so the question is, so what Hansen has done here is with the Zerubbabel argument. She does correctly mention, though, I should point out that that this is in the Greek. So when she's talking about verse 13, the next verse that says there's two of these guys, and one is Zerubbabel, that's in the Greek. It's not in the Hebrew. And it's important that the fact that Ben Jehozadak means son of God the righteous, you only know that if you know the Hebrew, right? So it's not in the Greek. It's not translated into the Greek as the son of God. It's just transliterated from the Hebrew. Now Philo knows Hebrew, like he's a freaking expert. So he knows that Jehozadak means son of God. But that means that he's aware of the Hebrew and probably might even be using Hebrew as the base text. It's entirely possible his Greek text matched the Hebrew text that we have, because we don't actually know what version of the Septuagint that he's looking at, right? We have our version, but that's like it's been thousands of years of, that comes from like hundreds of years later. So, trying to figure out what did the Septuagint, our version of the Septuagint, say exactly in Philo's time, and what did it say in Alexandria, and what did it say in Philo's library, right? So like that's less certain. But it is true that in the Greek, it preserves the mention of two men. And we do think Zerubbabel is the other guy, which would suggest that originally Zerubbabel was in verse 12. but he's dropped. It's a scribal error, and that error existed by the time of Philo. So in Philo's day, that Zerubbabel has been dropped from verse 12. So you would have to go to verse 13 and wonder, like, who are these two guys? Like, you would have to go through a process of thinking to figure out that there's some other guy who's supposed to be in verse 12, etc. We can do that as scholars now, like looking at it. We're more interested in reconstructing what Zechariah originally wrote, etc. Philo's not interested in that. He thinks it's wackadoo secret messaging, right? So he's less likely to actually go to the second verse in the Septuagint and say, oh, what's this? He's probably looking at the Hebrew, which says in verse 13, here's verse 13 in the Hebrew. I'm going to read it out. It is he, one person, who will build the temple of the Lord, and he, one person, will be clothed with majesty and will sit and rule on his throne. And he, one person, will be a priest on his throne, one person. And there will be harmony between the two. So harmony between the two preserves the original, that there being two persons. But now it's between a king and a priest. The verse has been altered to say that there's going to be one person who's going to be both king and priest, and there's going to be harmony between the two offices, right? So someone altered the passage to get rid of the king and the priest as two separate entities and to make them one person. And this is in the Hebrew. And it's entirely possible the Greek version that Philo's looking at might replicate the Hebrew, but even if it doesn't, he might well know the Hebrew says this. And so he might well disagree with Chrissy Hansen about the two-person hypothesis. Philo might think it's the two-office hypothesis that was intended by whoever's produced the Greek that we have, or the Hebrew that we have. And so that's the thing, is it's not as clear-cut as Chrissy Hansen is making out to say. When you look at the actual text, it's very easy to see it as one person being meant. And clearly, some scribes constructing the Hebrew text wanted us to think that there's only one person and not two, and it's Jesus, that Jesus is the one who will be both king and priest. And it is not a coincidence, I don't think, that Jesus was imagined to be both king and priest, and that this idea of unifying the king and priest, the two messiahs, appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in later Hebrew texts. So this idea had a lot of resonance across Judaism, and to find it in Christianity would not be surprising either. But in any case, it's not as clear cut. And so when we look at this, we have to look at the other evidence, which is the indication that Philo thinks Jesus is the only one being mentioned here. And the evidence, is, as I presented, is the fact that he thinks it's someone called the Son of God. He thinks that it's someone who's a high priest, not a king, or at least not a king specifically. Anyway, so that's not a proof, but it is evidence for, and so that's why I present that argument.
Would you consider it to be accurate to say that this particular argument of only assuming whatever the original now lost text was, and thinking that was the understanding of Philo at the time, would you say that it would be accurate to say that that's a bit anachronistic to do with this situation, being that, Philo most likely didn't have that text, but we're doing this textual criticism of it to figure out that, Zerubbabel may have originally been there, but Chrissy presents it as, it definitely was this, so that's what Philo thought.
Right. What Chrissy is doing, which is what a lot of scholars today do, is a completely different thing from what Philo is doing. That is true. Now, I wouldn't say it's anachronistic, because there were people in Philo's day who did that. And I give an example of, so there's a passage in Ezekiel, which is the Valley of Dry Bones, where Ezekiel describes like all these skeletons rise from the dead and flesh fills their skeletons and they're resurrected, right? So there's a debate in the Talmud. We actually have this in the Talmud. There's these two camps of rabbis. One camp is that, that's just a metaphor for the restoration of Israel. It's not to be taken literally. And then there's the other camp is like, no, it's literally, my ancestor was one of the skeletons. This is for real. This is an argument. So it's like, no, my ancestor, he swears he's one of he's like, my father said that he descended from one of the skeletons. And so therefore it must be literal. And so this is the debate. Now, obviously the side that's arguing that it was a metaphor is correct, right? Like the original story is a poetic metaphor for the restoration of Israel. Ezekiel did not stand in a valley and watch skeletons rise from the dead. That is not what happened. But there were rabbis who thought it did, is the point. And there were rabbis who argued with them and said, no, it's a freaking metaphor. So that argument existed, right? So you have both camps. And in the same way, like when you say Philo is like doing a pesher here, he's like finding hidden secret meanings in the text. Like he's saying what the literal meaning is for rubes, total rubes. Like if you're taking the literal meaning, you're an idiot, you're an outsider, you're damned, right? Like I'm one of the insiders. I know the secret meaning of everything. And the whole book is like all of his books are full of this. Like, oh, secret meaning. Here's the secret meaning of it's all different. But there were people who would argue with him, like the other camp of rabbis who would say, no, come on, dude. Originally, like there's something that's dropped out of here, but it was originally Zerubbabel. It was actually, it's all a reference to things going on then. So, and you get this in the debate between the Jews and the Christians on the virgin birth passage. You see this in various places. You see it in dialogue with Trypho, for example, where the Jews say, no, that's just, that was referring to a maiden who's going to give birth in the time of the prophet. It has nothing to do with the future. And the Christians are, no, it's a secret hidden message about the future and about our Messiah is going to be virgin born, etc. And so that debate actually tracks actual debates that happened among Jews back then. It's not a weird Christian thing. Like, so that's a kind of thing that happened. So there would probably be some Jew, some rabbi in Philo's day who would argue with Philo and say, no, it's Zerubbabel. Here's this text critical reason why it's Zerubbabel. So they would basically be agreeing with Chrissy Hansen on this. But the point is that would be a different person making a different argument. Clearly, Philo is not that person. And that's the point that I'm making, is that Philo is not doing this. Philo is not at all interested in text critical historicist arguments. He is doing a wackadoo Pesher analysis where everything has a secret mystical meaning. And so he's not at all interested in trying to reconstruct what Zechariah originally wrote. He's more interested in finding the secret, like magical meaning that's hidden behind the text. And so he's doing a different project that resembles more what was done in the Qumran community. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, what they're doing with the scriptures is exactly this kind of stuff. They're finding like weird alien space messiahs and all kinds of stuff in the scriptures, even though that's not at all anywhere in the scriptures. Philo's with them. Philo's not with the text critical people. So Hansen is arguing from the wrong perspective. And so I wouldn't say it's anachronistic. I would say it's just inapplicable to Philo, because Philo's in a different community. He's doing a different thing. And that's the thing that's important. And that we can prove from all of Philo's works. Like, it's obvious he's not a text critical scholar. It's obviously he's some sort of like Bible code mystic. Like he does, because he does it all of his books all the time.
Right. Thanks for clearing that up. I wasn't trying to suggest that Chrissy was being anachronistic, but I could see somebody being.
No, it's a valid question. Like, is she being anachronistic? And the answer is no. She's just applying the wrong methodology to Philo. Is what's going on.
Okay, let's continue, because we still wait. This one's a little bit longer, but we could probably get through it pretty quick.
Okay.
You have to completely misread the passage. So his theory has to be built on the idea that Philo misread the passage as indicating that Joshua the high priest is this Anatole, and then on top of it, then we have to infer that not only did he misread it, but that's what he intended to also get across to us. And there's no evidence of this. In no other extant work of Philo does he ever call his angel Jesus. And it's just a game of psychologizing. I don't think it's likely. I don't think it's even worth engaging. And I also don't even see how it's relevant to his argumentation. Not that it matters, because Carrier has a habit of just every time you criticize him saying it wasn't important to begin with. So I'm probably going to get a video essay now from him and John Gleason railing me about this. Cool. I can't wait.
Yeah. Fall on. So that wasn't important to begin with. Of course, that's another hyperbolic, straw man. I didn't say it wasn't important, right? I said it's not evidence, right? I don't use it as evidence for the non-existence of Jesus, which is explicit. That's in the book. I very clearly explain that the material in chapters 4 and 5 are background information that are not evidence that decides one way or the other. They're only pieces of information that we have to use to condition our probabilities later on. And the point being is all the evidence in chapters 4 and 5 of On the Historicity of Jesus, all of it is 100% compatible with both theories. And so that's why it's not evidence for one theory against another. It's because it's equally likely on both theories. It can't tell you anything. All it does is constrain your theories. And so there are historicist theories that are completely compatible with that information. And there are mythicist theories that are as well. There are also historicist theories that aren't compatible with it. And there are mythicist theories that aren't compatible with it. And those theories are therefore refuted by that evidence. That is true. But it doesn't resolve the ultimate question of historicity versus myth, because there are historicist theories that fit all of that evidence in those things. And I say this explicitly. I explain it in excruciating detail like first chapter 1. I go into like what's the point of those chapters. I explain it again in those chapters. So that this is clearly just, they're not reading the book. They're not paying attention to it. They're not taking it seriously. And so that's, again, I'm not like backtracking. This isn't goalpost moving. This has always been the position I've taken. And they're the ones who've mistaken it. There's the ones who've taken it in the wrong direction.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then the other point is like the misreading the passage. The idea of misreading the passage is kind of a loaded word, because the passage as it existed in Philo's day doesn't have to be misread. The passage as written says what I'm saying. Like it says Jesus is the anatolate, right? Like it's very plain. There's no one else in the verse. So you have to reconstruct someone else being in the verse who's not there. And that requires an elaborate argument, right? Like, and I think the argument is correct in terms of Zechariah, like the original author of the book. But you do have to reconstruct that. It's not there. Like when Philo's looking at the verse, it says what it says. The verse is erroneous, but that's, it's been corrupted over time. But if you look at the Hebrew verse 13 versus the Greek verse 13, you can see how it's been altered over time, right? You can actually see that that's happened. So Philo's not misreading it. He's just not doing a text critical approach to try and reconstruct the original meaning. He's just taking it as the divine word of God as written, whatever he's seeing too. We also don't know what text he's seeing, as I mentioned. And again, like there's no evidence for this. I presented the evidence. There is evidence for this. I presented it, and so I won't belabor that. But anyway, those are the three points that I would make about that. And again, they're the ones who are making the mistakes here. Like I've not changed my position. My positions remain the same since the book published. It's in the book. Like you just read it. They're the ones who keep getting the argument wrong and just straw manning it and coming up with this other, the straw manning it and then blaming me for straw manning it, even though they're the ones who straw manned it. But it's kind of frustrating when that happens. But anyway,
maybe you have a good explanation for this, but I can't understand why Chrissy would present it as, well, Carrier has to misread the passage in order to not understand.
She says Philo.
Oh, does she say?
She says
Philo?
I am claiming that Philo misread the passage, which is true from her perspective, because she's doing a text critical thing where she's reinventing, she's reconstructing a passage that doesn't exist, and then saying that he's misreading it. That he would have to misread it. But for him to misread it, he would have to go through that process she went through to do that text critical method of reconstructing the original passage, which doesn't exist or didn't exist in his time either. Then if he went through that process, then he would have to misread it. But what I'm saying is that he's not even doing that. He doesn't care about doing that. That's not a thing he ever does. He's not interested in text critical analysis or reconstruction of the text. He's just reading what's written. And if you do that, then my argument follows. And that's I think what she doesn't understand is like she's trying to pretend, or she's imagining that Philo thinks like her, and all the evidence proves that Philo absolutely does not think like her. And once you abandon that assumption, her whole argument falls away, and what you end up with is my argument, which is how I ended up where I am. And so anyway, that's my analysis of that.
Did you understand what she meant when she was talking about like the idea of you psychologizing? Like I didn't understand what she meant by that part.
I don't want to read too much into it because I don't. I mean, I can infer, but I don't want to like put words into her mouth. But I assume this is a reference to, because there's also Neil makes an argument like this. It's completely wackadoo. I don't want to attribute Neil's mistakes to her because Neil is way less intelligent than Chrissy Hansen is, and makes way worse mistakes than Chrissy Hansen does. But what I think she means is that I'm trying to interpret the thoughts of Philo through the text, which is true.
Okay.
But we always do that. That's all writing is expressions of the thought of a person. And so we're always trying to infer what the person is thinking from what they wrote. That's the whole point of writing. So we always have to psychologize. So saying that you're psychologizing isn't a valid criticism. What I would do if I were to steel man her argument, I would say that I'm over psychologizing, that I'm somehow like I'm trying to get into Philo's head further than the evidence will allow me to go. And that in and of itself would be a valid argument. It just doesn't apply in this case because I have concrete evidence for my inferences. And she's not addressing that. She's not describing that evidence. She's not responding to it. She's not responding to the probability argument at all. So she's just ignoring my actual argument. But I understand what that might mean. And it's one of those examples where an apologetic argument looks exactly like an honest argument. You have to get behind it to figure out which it is. So the idea of over psychologizing is true. That can happen. And it could be if everything she assumes is true, I would be doing that. It's just that she's wrong about those assumptions, and therefore she's wrong about me over psychologizing. I'm just doing straightforward standard literary analysis.
I would think that if you were over psychologizing, you would have more ad hoc claims like attached to it. Like there would be claims,
well, which is what she
would,
right? Yeah, she's ignoring the evidence. Like she says, I have no evidence, so she doesn't even know what it is, right? Like I have evidence, I presented it. So she's not even aware, for whatever reason, that I have evidence for my position. So, but if that were true, like if her belief were true that I had no evidence for this, then her conclusion that I'm over psychologizing would be true, right? Like if I didn't have this evidence, then yeah, I would be doing that. But I do have the evidence, therefore I'm not doing that. And so that's what's going on here, I think.
Okay.
But like,
Yeah.
there's no indication of this anywhere in the text. If you read the following verse, it says that these are two different distinct figures, and you just have to basically just say that Philo misread the passage, and we have no indication that he did because he never explicitly identifies the two. So it's just, there's no point. And also this same distinction is also true in the Hebrew as well. You can look up Mark Boda's commentary on this passage, even to the extent where like they're crowning Joshua in this passage. Crowning the priest is also exhibited in other texts that Mark J. Boda also notes. So there's just nothing there. The only thing I'm going to agree with Carrier on here is that Philo's angel does have a lot of like linguistic similarities in terminology to Jesus as a pre-existent being in other texts. I've never denied that. I just don't think that you can argue he had a pre-Christian Jesus in his text. He had a
Right, the name. So they're concerned about the name. I'm glad to hear Chrissy Hansen agree that once you abandon the name, you still have the angel and all the attributes. It's clear that Jesus is being associated with that angel, but which has always been my argument. But yeah, you can proceed unless you had something else to remark.
Well, I find it interesting because I know I saw you shaking your head out of the corner of my eye because Chrissy says that the whole Zerubbabel interpretation exists in the Hebrew,
right?
And
she clearly is not aware that the verse is different. Yeah, verse 13 is different in the Hebrew than the Greek, and that's important. Yeah, and that's also why. Let's see. Do I have that here? Let's see. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to throw another one up in Facebook, and this is another because she's commented on, and I guess I don't want to like overclaim. Certainly others like Neil Senlak have overclaimed this, that I'm alone. I'm the only person. And that this would, I think Neil himself said like this would never pass peer review. I mean, it has 4 times. It's passed peer review 4 times.
With your second edition, it'll pass at least 2 more times, right? Or
one more time. Yeah. It would be the 5th time. No, bring that slide up that I just threw you, which is from my response to Chrissy Hansen on this point. So people who look for that article will find this in there, and I'll explain what's in here. And so what we have is multiple scholars. So what I point out is that multiple scholars under peer review. Also Lataster, I should point out, Raphael Lataster also published this argument. It also passed peer review under Brill. So that's 2 cases of the explicit argument that I've made. But there are other examples of scholars who admit that people understood at this time that Jesus is the one who's being called the Anatole. Now, they don't talk about Philo and the Archangel or any of that stuff. But what these scholars do is they say that the Zerubbabel thing has been lost. No one's thinking that there are scholars who think, or there are people of the ancient world like Philo who are reading this verse as Jesus is the one who is called the Anatole. And this has passed peer review multiple times. And their point is the same point as mine, which is that like there's a difference between what Zechariah meant when he wrote and what later exegetes, like in Philo's day, are thinking he wrote, like what they're reading. And by the time the passage got to them through all those corruptions, they agree that like the dominant view was that Jesus is the Anatole. They're not saying that that's what Zechariah wrote. They're saying is that that's what people understood Zechariah to have written in a later century. And so that this is important because this is what they're denying and what I'm pointing out is actually the case. And so I cite multiple books. I went looking for examples of people using this. So the Johannine Exegesis of God, this is published by De Gruyter, which is a major peer-reviewed press. That's Daniel Sadananda. There was Wayne Meeks and the Prophet King. That's Brill. That's a major peer-reviewed publication. They both, and I give the citations, you can see them in the thing there. They both assume this. They're making the same argument I am on that regard, and Lataster as well. So that's 4 times. It's me, Lataster, Meeks, and Sadananda. 4 times. Major peer-reviewed presses have all published this. Yes. At that time, people were reading it as Jesus being the Anatole. So, and again, I want to make clear because I know people like this is the thing, like they might quote what I just said out of context. I want to put this in the video so that you can get them by putting it here. Is I am not saying that these authors think that Zechariah originally wrote that. They are saying that that is how it was being read. And that's what I'm saying as well. I'm not saying that's what Zechariah wrote. I am saying that is what people are reading it. And by the time of Philo, that's how they're reading it. This is a mainstream argument. It's multiply peer reviewed. This is not some wackadoo thing that I just invented. So anyway, I wanted to make that clear.
Yeah. And when I initially heard Chrissy just then, say, well, if you just, read this author, they agree that it was originally Zerubbabel or whatnot. I feel like that somebody could easily take that as, oh, this person believes the same thing that Chrissy does in that Philo knew it was Zerubbabel and not just that Zechariah originally wrote about Zerubbabel, because those are 2 very different arguments. And this is actually a common problem that comes up in these kinds of discussions, is differentiating between original context or what the original author wrote or meant and how these first century Jews and Jewish Christians were reinterpreting or even reading the passages.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out because Christians and Jews like Philo are absolutely not reading it in the original sense. Like there are some who are, but they're not Philo. Philo's not one of them. Christians aren't doing it either, right? So yeah, what Christy is doing is assuming that Philo thinks like her, that Philo is a text critical scholar who's only interested in reconstructing the original sense of Zechariah, but he's not. That's not his game. He is a Pesherist. So he thinks that all of this is God breathed and it says what it says and it has secret messages. It has mystical meanings. And that's all that Philo's doing, like before and after this. Like it's just constant finding secret, weird interpretations of these verses. At no point does Philo do what Chrissy Hansen's doing, which is try to do a text critical reconstruction of the corrupted text to get at what Zechariah originally read or originally meant. Like I said, there were rabbis then who did that, but they were constantly arguing with rabbis who didn't like doing that. They were doing what Philo was doing. Or doing something even weirder, and so that's the distinction here. And I think it's because Chrissy thinks that Philo thinks like her. All her argument proceeds like that, and there's tons of evidence that Philo does not think like her. Philo thinks in a completely different way. And if you want to understand Philo, you have to see things through Philo's eyes, the way Philo thinks, not the way like some other rabbi would have thought. And that's important to how to do this correctly.
Right.
Get a pre-Christian angel that looks like Jesus. It's not called Jesus. There's no way to prove that it was ever meant to be Jesus. So, anyways.
Yeah, and then what he'll do is he'll go after people saying, "Oh, what's your credentials? Or, do you have a PhD?" And it just keeps going.
He's
on and
already
on and on.
he's already gone after me for that. It's like, well, I don't have any.
Yeah.
You don't have any relevant credentials. Like, okay, I have
Yeah.
more peer-reviewed papers on New Testament history than you do.
Yeah, that's a burn.
Sorry, I just gotta laugh at that.
Yeah. Yeah, especially since I don't do that. I do mention that she doesn't have credentials. I think that's relevant if you're going to analyze what she's doing. But I don't use that to dismiss anything she says. I
Right.
take seriously everything she says. I analyze it. I look at the evidence, and I just answer whether the evidence holds up or not. And in fact, I've actually praised her competence in many regards. Like, I do think she fucks up in a lot of ways, and in ways that I think are indicative of someone who hasn't gotten a PhD. But I don't assume that that's happening at any point. Like, if I'm going to assume that, I'm going to prove it. Like, I'm going to give specific evidence in a specific case. And so that's then, which is what I do. When I analyze her work, I take her seriously and say, like, this is what she said. This is the evidence she presented. Here's the actual facts when I fact check this. And so, like, I'm like treating her work like I would any other scholar. But it is relevant that she doesn't have a PhD, and it doesn't have, as far as I know, any relevant degrees. And that explains a lot in terms of the mistakes she makes. But that is not a valid way to dismiss her arguments. You can't say that she's wrong because she doesn't have a PhD. If she's right or wrong, it depends on the evidence she presents. That's it, right? So that's the way you need to treat it. And I would say that, and I have said that, she's actually cut above most of these amateurs who do really crappy jobs. Like Neil Sedlak is a classic example. It's like, he's completely incompetent. Christy Hansen is not completely incompetent. Like, she knows how to do things correctly. She just doesn't from time to time. And I've noticed even some PhDs make those same kinds of mistakes. Like, they have the skills, but whether they choose to use them or not is a whole separate question. But again, you can't just assume that. You've got to actually go in and find examples and actually address their evidence anyway.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in an earlier clip on the last stream that we did, she proudly said that, oh, I only have a BS in creative writing, or BA.
It would be a BA if it was creative writing.
A BA, okay, a BA in creative writing. And so she seemed rather maybe not proud of it, but she was just like, I've got a BA in creative writing, like, and everything. So I don't know. I don't dismiss people either, like, just because they don't have like a PhD. Now, if they're sitting there trying to say, oh, well, Carrier doesn't know what he's talking about, or whatever scholar doesn't know, because I've had people say that about other people that I've referenced in addition to you. It's like, well, they don't know what they're talking about. And it's like, oh, well, I'm sorry, they have a PhD, and they got this peer reviewed and everything like that. But yeah, fuck them, kind of in jest.
Yeah, and I think Chrissy Hansen has done this as well. Like the whole idea of claiming credentials don't matter, and then out of the other side of their mouth, impugning someone's credentials, right? So this is a game they play. It's not a game I play. And they've accused me of playing that game. No, they're the ones who play this game. I don't.
Okay.
So, like, it's just the whole like, I'm a PhD, you're not a relevant specialist, blah, blah, blah. It's like, so what? Doesn't make me any less right. It's irrelevant.
It has nothing to do with the evidence. It doesn't. It's not like it's a magic wand that suddenly changes the evidence. It just doesn't. The evidence stays the same.
Exactly. Everything changes. Everything stays the same, no matter how many credentials I have on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really care to get credentials in New Testament history, because, sorry to all the New Testament scholars and biblical scholars watching this, but I don't like what I see in this field. I don't like a lot of the interactions I see going on. I like keeping my arms. I like doing this as a hobby and keeping my arms distance. So anyway.
Well, criticize me for making exactly the same point. That's why I do not want a professorship. I agree with Hansen on this. Like, she's right. Like, I think the PhD is valuable if you want to do work in this field, but it's usually the professorship. Do you have a prestigious enough professorship? It's like, no, professorships suck. They're the worst jobs in the world now. They're underpaid. They're shitty. They're overworked. And the politics and shit you have to deal with are mind numbing. Yeah. So, and that's what Hanson's talking about. So I completely sympathize with her on that. But I would wish, because especially she has the intelligence and the capability, I would wish she would go for a PhD, just because, not so that she could claim she has a PhD, but so she would get the skills, because that was so valuable to me. Like if I look at myself back in 2005, for example, or worse, like 1997, when all of this began, when I began writing altogether, the PhD helped immensely. Like it gave me a ton of knowledge and skills that I would not have had otherwise. And I think if you want to publish on this subject, you really should go for it. Now, I totally understand why someone wouldn't, because it's too expensive. It's expensive, not just in money, but in time. No one has the time. And even if someone has the time, they don't have the money. And so I totally sympathize with that. But it is, if you can do it, I highly recommend doing it, because if this is the thing you want to do, you want to write in this, even as a hobby, if you want to be competent at it and really know what you're talking about, it is super valuable to get that PhD, because you'll learn a zillion things going through it. So that's what I do recommend for people.
It's a little bit of a mind fuck for me to hear like Chrissy, denigrate this position of, oh, well, this person doesn't have a PhD, so just totally dismissing them, because
Right.
I'm not saying
And
that
then doing
she's
this.
done this.
Yeah, right, yeah, exactly.
Well, not that she's done this, but other people have been like,
Yes.
well, New Testament scholars think you're fucking wrong, so who am I going to believe? And so it's a little bit of a mind fuck for me, because it's like, well, I also have scholars that I can cite that, refute you. And they're like, but are they Bart Ehrman?
Right. That's an example of goalpost moving, right? Like everybody says, well, you don't have a PhD. Then I get a PhD, and they go, well, now PhDs don't matter. And like, well, you don't have, your argument isn't peer reviewed. And then I get it peer reviewed. And they go, well, peer review doesn't matter, right? Like they keep moving the goalposts. That's classic goalpost moving. I can't say that Hanson herself does this, but a lot of people do, especially in this particular argument that we deal with. But it's worth keeping your eye out for that. But to be fair, like I totally take Chrissy Hanson seriously and address her arguments on the basis of their actual evidence. I don't just dismiss her because she doesn't have a PhD.
Right.
Anyways, there's no evidence there's no evidence that he even meant to infer that it was named Jesus. This is just guesswork.
Yeah. Which obviously we've seen as false, because you've here presented the argument as it exists currently in your book.
Yeah.
And so it amazes me that they're saying there's no evidence for this. Oh, well, what about this evidence? Well, that's not evidence. is pretty much their comeback.
Yeah, and that would be at least a valid argument if they can explain what they mean by when something is not evidence, right? Like there's a legitimate case to be made that something isn't evidence, which is when it's a fact, like it exists and it's true, but its being true does not increase the probability of either conclusion. In that case, it is not, by definition, it is then not evidence for either conclusion. And that is actually how I define it on the historicity of Jesus. It is not evidence for or against the historicity of Jesus, because it does not change the probability that Jesus existed. It's equally compatible with both theories. So there is a legitimate way to make that argument. This gets to the point I made earlier about apologetics looks identical to a legitimate argument. So there can be a legitimate argument that something is not evidence. It's a fact, but it is still not evidence. But this is not one of those cases, because the evidence that I'm presenting is more probable on my theory than on the opposite, because the opposite requires assuming a coincidence, and coincidences are by definition improbable, whereas my theory requires no coincidence, so it lacks that improbability. And so you have an improbable claim that there's a massively convenient coincidence, or you have this claim that has no coincidence at all, and this is a more probable. And so that makes it evidence. That's why the facts I present are evidence for my theory. One can only quibble about how strong an evidence they are. That is the only argument that can be legitimately had. But they're not even engaging with the argument. They won't even admit the evidence exists, right? So they're not even trying to argue that it's too weak, right? So they're not saying, oh, yeah, he's got evidence, but it's too weak. That's not their argument. They won't even talk about the evidence. It's not even mentioned, right? They never brought it up.
Right.
They just declare that it doesn't exist. And so that is illegitimate. That is an illegitimate response to the presentation of evidence.
I agree.
Yeah, and when he gets angry, he does videos with people on YouTube, bashing other people, or he'll write a bunch of articles all day long. And
Oh yeah, I've got
all day long. I publish articles all day long.
to me now. I'm a liar. Wait,
You know, I obsessively never publish more than one article a day, and I rarely publish more than one a day, right? Like or like sequentially. Like even if I do sequentially, it's like 4. I never publish more than 4 a month. Like rarely, maybe 5, but it's usually 4 a month. So yeah, the hyperbole is just is amusing. They don't like it when I do a long form refutation of what they're talking about. How dare you critique me?
Yeah. And now, so Chrissy was complaining about being labeled a liar, a crank, and they're gonna lead into something else.
Right. Yeah.
I'm in good company now. I'm with Maurice Casey, Stephanie Fisher, Tim O'Neill now.
Good company.
The company.
Yeah, I know. I don't see how that's good company.
These are horribly dishonest people. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to say that to actually be proud to be like these people is a bit disingenuous. It really indicates that they have no standards. If you can't see that. But yeah, this whole idea, like if I catch you lying, I'm going to prove it. So I never just claim someone's a liar. Like that's never an argument. If I'm going to say you're a liar, I'm going to have proof, right? So if someone's like bothered by that, go check my evidence and then ask yourself, like, is this evidence of lying? Because it is. Yeah, if someone's going to lie, and I have caught Chrissy Hansen in lying, blatant, really like would get you fired from a professorship kind of lying. But I document it. So you don't have to take my word for it. You can fact check it yourself. You can I cite the sources. You can go check. Like she makes a claim about a source. You can go check that source yourself and see that it's false, that she has lied about that source. So that has happened. I think it's egregious and pathetic and deeply unethical. And I think she should fix all that. Like if I was an honest person and got caught in those kinds of mistakes, and if they were mistakes, I would say, oh, fuck, those are like horrible mistakes. I'm going to fix them. I'm going to apologize and correct. She doesn't do that, which is how I know like it's lying, right? Like a liar is someone who covers up their lies. Someone who makes an honest mistake fixes it. And that's how you tell the difference. But anyway, if people are interested in that, you can find, I have tons of examples and I give you the breadcrumbs so you can actually fact check it yourself. You don't have to rely on me.
Yep.
Company I get to keep now by the honorific of crank is great.
At this point,
I can already hear Joel Pearson recording us right now.
I had to laugh at that a little bit because they're actively streaming this on Jacob's channel. Like Joel doesn't have to record anything. They're doing it for us.
Yeah. It's not like a secret backroom conversation being surreptitiously recorded. That's a valid point.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't care. I mean, it's I'm at the point that I just don't care. You can make 50 videos. I don't care.
And at that point, Jacob gives up. I don't give a fuck. He can make any kind of videos that he wants to. I don't know. I had a little bit of laugh about that because he politely asked me to not make any more response videos to him, even though he's still going to be pumping out like interviews with people on this.
Yeah. That's just dumb. right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we got another super chat actually from Camel Gregor again.
Cool.
Thank you for your super chat, Camel. If we can infer that Philo believed the Logos was named Joshua, can we also infer that Philo believed the Logos had a father named Josadak? That's the father of the high priest.
What? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I
What?
don't understand this either.
Josadak
because-
would be the father, not the other way around.
right.
Josadak it's Ben Jehozadak. So it's son of God the righteous. So the Logos is the
And-
son of God the righteous in my scenario, right? So Camille Gregor seems to think it's the other way around, that somehow wait, so I got to read the text. So you've got it covered up because you've got the
Of course.
Let's see. I don't know if I can get it. I can't get this to go away.
Let me
One
see if I
second.
oh, my glasses, I can't read it.
Well, it says if we can infer. Sorry, let me get this.
Yeah,
pulled
that
up.
Philo believed the Logos was named Joshua. Can we also infer that Philo believed? That's the part I can't read. I can't read the seconds. I want to make sure I'm.
Can we
getting it right.
Can we also infer that Philo believed the Logos has a father named Jehozadak?
So the answer is yes, because Jehozadak is God the righteous, and Philo says that God is the father of the Logos. Right. So the only thing I can assume is that Camille Gregor doesn't know that Josadak means God the righteous. That's the only thing I can assume that's going on here. And that's probably why Chrissy has a mystified face. I wonder if Hansen's mystified by the question in the way I am, but let's see.
Yeah.
Of course not. We can't infer that. We have to infer that this Jesus was made by conception via heavenly sperm that was stored for
Okay,
David.
that's just a mocking reference. It has nothing to do with the
In the-
Philo argument. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sperm bank in the sky.
It just makes me laugh every time I hear about it.
Josadak was just the adoptive father, like Joseph.
Yeah. So I left this part in primarily because I feel like it just shows because they're mocking the whole cosmic sperm bank thing, but in responding to Tim O'Neill on this and really going through all of the evidence, like you even say on the history of Jesus that the whole cosmic sperm bank, or at least God harvesting the sperm from David, is easily read out of scripture and everything. So it seems weird to me, like however you want to characterize like cosmic sperm bank, or maybe God just palmed David's sperm for like a millennia.
Yeah. But that's all Christian stuff. This is the thing that's annoying me, is that we're supposed to be talking about Philo. Obviously Philo doesn't believe any of that. That's Christian shit, right? So so here's the thing, is like when Philo is talking about the Logos being the firstborn son of God, he doesn't mean that God stuck his penis in a vagina and someone, like a womb gave birth to like had a fetus and whatever, and then the Logos popped out. No, he means God just fucking made him, like done, like you exist now. So the Logos is the first created being. So God just wished him into existence, and that makes him the firstborn son of God. So it has nothing to do with sperm, nothing to do with penises or vaginas. It is just God creating the first being. The first being is God's creation, therefore it's God's son. That's Philo. That's what Philo says. Philo does not have any notion, obviously, that this entity became incarnate, right? Like that's the one thing that's not in Philo. Philo has no knowledge of this entity ever being believed to have become incarnate and died and all of that stuff. That is what the Christians did. The Christians came up with this idea that this Logos acquired a mortal body, became incarnate, and then died and then rose again. Like that's what makes Christianity different from all the other Jewish sects. They came up with this one innovative idea of that, right? So that's a Christian thing. That's not going to be in Philo. So obviously that's not in Philo. So when Philo says that Ben Jehozadak means son of God the righteous, he means created. He doesn't mean like biological reproduction. But when we get to what they're talking about, which is the sperm hypothesis, that's how the body was the son of David. So how could someone be the son of God and the son of David at the same time? You can't have two fathers, right? This isn't the expanse where you have multiple fathers producing a single child, right? So what is going on here? So one is God is creating. So it's the same way that God created the Logos. He just created it, just made it. And that makes him the Father. And so that's how he's the Father of the Logos. That's how he's Jesus' Father. He made him. He didn't go down to earth and screw anybody and make them pregnant. That is not what God did. So that's not what makes Jesus the Son of God. It's not biological. But Jesus is still the son of David, right? So how is he the son of David? How is his mortal body Davidic? Well, that's a different thing. So that's a Christian thing. The Christians came up with this. This is not in Judaism. This is a Christian thing. And that's when we get into the whole idea of like, how could that happen? Now, it could happen metaphorically or it could happen physically. And I give two scenarios and I give background evidence supporting both scenarios. So there's two different ways it can happen. One of which is that God did it literally the way Nathan predicted, which is that God just took the semen from David, held onto it, waited, and then made a body out of it and made it in the womb of Mary. Because this is in the Gospels. Joseph, who's the descendant of David, never imparts the sperm to Mary, right? Mm-hmm. So how is her baby the son of David? It's not, right? So how does that happen? Well, because God made the fetus in the womb. Well, what did he make it out of? Well, he made it out of Davidic sperm because that's what Nathan said he would do. Like Nathan literally says that he predicts that this is what God will do. Well, that's why, right? Like it's not like I made this up. Nathan said it, right? Like I'm just saying, like this is how Jews would interpret this, right? So
no, come on.
Anyway.
Look, Rick, listen, okay? Obviously, God used a turkey baster, and then that's how he impregnated.
Yeah, he totally could have.
Jesus' mother.
Yeah, outer space turkey baster, he totally could. And that's why, like now, like in Jesus from Outer Space, I found the passage in the Talmud that talks about Layla, that God had a whole angel that their job was collecting semen. Like that's literally what they did, is they went around grabbing semen out of the testicles of men, carrying it to God and saying, hey, holding it, literally physically holding it up to God and say, hey, God, is this going to be a rich man, a poor man, a bad man, a good man? And then God will say, oh, I predict this. Okay, go take it back and put it in. So there's nothing like that's wackadoo. Yeah, but it's their wackadoo belief. I didn't make it up. Like that's what they believed. I mean, so yeah. So when I'm saying that they just God held on to it, like that's completely in line with their actual beliefs. Like this isn't some wackadoo thing that I made up. This is their thing. This is a Jewish belief, and that's why I bring it up, is because the Jews had this belief, and therefore it actually is an available explanation for the Christian belief.
Rick, the part that fucked me up in what you just said was they took the sperm back and put it back in the balls.
Yes,
and
they did.
I feel like that would be painful.
No, there's magic.
It's like toothpaste getting put back in the tube.
You won't even know. You won't even know. You
don't even know.
Yeah, you're anesthetized. You're anesthetized. You don't even know. Yeah, it's magic. It's fucking angels, man. That's the thing.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Anyways, yeah. So there wasn't really much left. There was a little bit left, but I think it's all pretty mockery type stuff.
Yeah.
But it's really funny how it always devolves into that, right? Like it always devolves into like the mockery of the position. Like, oh, this is crazy because, I mentioned this at the very beginning when I was first talking about Bart Ehrman's How Jesus Became God. But while Philo didn't consider his Logos to have attained a corporeal body, to do stuff in, he did think of that for Moses. Like he thought of Moses as a divine figure.
Philo also has a whole section where he says that angels and demons can do this, right? So he understands the theory. He even gives us the model for the theory. He says they can do this anytime they want. They can come down, assume a mortal body, and shed it anytime. Like this is in Philo. Like so he understands the concept. Like he practically I don't think he invented this. I think he's repeating views that were commonly held. But he gives us the theory, the metaphysics of how angelic beings could become mortal briefly. So yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah. To which later on in the week, Neil is going to describe all of this as like aliens meeting the president is how he describes it. And it's incredibly weird to hear that, because
it's actually weirder than that is the thing. Like actual Jewish beliefs are weirder than that. That's the thing. Like they think that's weird. Like there's isn't it weird that aliens met the president? No, that's actually less weird than the things they actually believed. They thought there was like a vault in like one of the levels of heaven that contained like literal vaults, like boxes that contained snow. Like the snow just sat in there.
Mhm.
And so when it snowed, they just open the boxes and the snow comes down. Like, this is fucking wackadoo crazy shit, but it's what they believed. I'm not making this up. This is them. This is their belief system.
I
You
believe
can't dismiss it because it's crazy. It's all crazy. Yeah, their whole belief system is crazy. The whole early Christianity, whole early Judaism, it's wackadoo. It's fucking crazy. It's all is crazy. And so if you don't recognize that, if you don't acknowledge that, then that's when you're being anachronistic, right? Is when you're trying to apply current scientific understandings, current Judaism, current Christianity, and using those interpretations and applying them to the ancients. That's anachronistic. If you want to understand the ancients, you have to meet them on their own terms. You have to go look at what did they actually believe. And they didn't believe any of this modern stuff. They believed completely crazy, weird ass things. And so if you want to understand their thought, you do have to go into the context of what they actually believe. And that means you have to go read things that they wrote and see the things. Like there's the whole book, The Life of Adam and Eve, that has the Garden of Eden is in the third heaven. It's very explicit. Adam and Eve are in the third heaven. And then when they fall, it's a literal fall from the third heaven to earth. And then they go to the dim copy of Eden on earth. And so they're not in the real Garden of Eden. They're in the shitty version, like the ghetto version of Eden, which is on earth. And then when they die, the angels take their bodies back up to the third heaven and bury them in the soil of the original Garden of Eden. This is an actual book. It's an actual pre-Christian Jewish text. Paul references it in 2 Corinthians 12. So Paul read it and believed it was true. So yeah, that's wackadoo. It's crazy, but it's what they believed. And so if you want to understand them, you have to understand what they actually believed from the actual context, the things they actually said and the things they actually wrote. And that's just the proper way to approach this.
Yeah, which I do have a clip from McGrath that where he disagrees with that particular interpretation. Obviously he disagrees, but we don't have time to get to that.
I have an article on it. So for people who want to contrast what he says with what I do a full article on it. I think it's Adam's Burial in Outer Space is the title.
Yeah.
And that's on my blog. So people can check that. And I go through it. I show you the evidence, quote the passages, etc. So there isn't any way to argue against it. Not any honest way. So like you could go look at like later medieval redactions of the life of Adam and Eve that lack this. But that would be disingenuous because we need to look at the original text and you have to look at the earlier Greek text and so on. And so you can't look at the medieval text that expunged all of this stuff. You've got to look at the earlier stuff. But anyway, that's all described and discussed in my article. So if people are interested in that, it's there.
Yeah, I'll try to remember to get that in the description. I've got the other article that we referenced earlier in the description already, but we are going to move to looking at the super chats, which I know that there's some member chats, but we're going to try to get through these here tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Carrier, for coming on and sort of going through all this because there's been a lot of criticism levied at the Philo Angel. And
no, this has been good. I really appreciate this because we actually hit all the key points I think need to be hit. We articulated them. We went through them well. We gave them their shot, like they have their arguments. So this is I think a useful response video. It's not just a shitlord video. So
yeah,
it's handy. So I think people will find it useful.
Yeah. So if anybody has a question that you would like to ask of Dr. Carrier, now's your chance to get it in. But we will be going through super chats now. So thank you for watching. If you're going to bail out at this point, but that's the point we're at in the show. Jacob B says happy pagan holiday to Dr. Carrier and GE.
Sweet. Yeah.
Thank you there, Jacob B. Jacob also has another question. Saying the existence of any messianic prophecies is sufficient evidence for the idea of a figure like Jesus existing conceptually before Jesus did.
That's true. I think usually to steelman the argument, usually the debate is the idea of celestial messiahs or pre-existent messiahs. And you showed a video of Chrissy Hansen admitting that there is evidence of pre-Christian Jewish belief in pre-existent celestial messiahs. So, which is true. There's tons of scholarship on this. Not all scholars agree with that, but there's enough literature to establish it, and I think the evidence is solid. But yeah, if you go through the texts, like there's explicit messianic passages in the Old Testament that give you plenty of material for inventing a messiah. but there's also passages that you can spin in the way that you want. And so that's, and that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like you look at like the Melchizedek scroll, the crazy shit they're coming up with by connecting weird ass, like random verses and connecting them together and coming up with bizarre, alien messiahs coming down and having wars in the sky and stuff like that. Like that's there, right? So they're actually coming up with that stuff. And that's before Christianity. So that's already going on. The question is that what's happened to Christianity? And that depends on a deeper dive on the evidence. Like, I don't think there's any smoking gun on this. I think the evidence tends towards a conclusion, but it's not a conclusive case, as I can make conclusive cases for many other things in the ancient world, but not for this.
Oh, but Rick, I've heard plenty of people online say that you definitively say 100% no evidence whatsoever for Jesus existing.
Yeah, right. No, absurd. Even by my own Bayesian definition of evidence, I actually acknowledge that there could be evidence. I think there's not, but I think I do actually credit some pieces of information as evidence for the historicity of Jesus. And on the historicity of Jesus, I include all the biological stuff, so all the family stuff. So father, mother, and brothers evidence in Paul. I weigh in favor of historicity weekly, but I do weigh it in that direction, and I weigh it weekly for reasons that I give out in the book.
Right. Daniel M. much earlier said David says good night. David is Daniel's son who watches the show. But I hope everybody had a good night there, Daniel and David. If you see this, I hope you had a good night too there, bud.
Yeah.
We're like a big family here on the channel. So Rainbow Krampus says Mark is great. Yes, thank you. It's very effective as a sales pitch.
Yeah, I think
it
it's
means
more
the
of
gospel
a.
march?
I don't think it's a sales pitch so much as a manual. And this is an important distinction because there is a debate in the field as to whether the Gospels are meant to promote Christianity to non-Christians, or if they're manuals for missionaries to promote Christianity, right? And in a big way, the more the Gospels go on, there are more arguments among Christians. So like Luke is really writing to Christians more than he's writing to non-Christians. He's keeping that audience in mind, but his main audience is fellow Christians. John is totally arguing for Christians, like that he's trying to win arguments within Christianity. He's not terribly interested in non-believers. But yeah, when you get to Mark, I think what he's written is a manual for missionaries. So if you're a missionary and you're going around and you run into an argument and you can, oh shit, the book's got a thing for that, right? Like, so you go in there like, you people are crazy. Oh, there's a thing for that. Like Jesus was called crazy. Let me tell you a story. And like, but you're telling people to leave their family and join this fictional family. There's a story for that. Like, let me tell you about this. And then they use that as their plug. It's like a musician who has like, there's a word for it. I can't remember. They have like, they have a book that has like a few notes for each song. And it's just enough for them to, it's a cue sheet basically for them to remember how to play. So if someone asks you to play a random song, you can find that you just find a few notes and you know enough to like fake the rest of it. So people who are like traveling musicians do this. And I think Mark is like that it's a collection of stories that a missionary can use as cues to start their speech, right? They'll tell a little story and then they'll exegete that story to everybody, right? So I think that's the main goal of Mark. Now, there's a lot of like artistry in the construction of Mark. The total structure, like the whole book is a brilliant architecture with ring structure and the whole thing. Like it's masterfully constructed. So I think Mark is trying to like create a whole manual for the whole religion, and he wants the structure to have an affective effect on the reader. So I think he wants to inspire missionaries. Missionaries will read the text, they'll see all this brilliant structure, and they'll see all the brilliant meaning, and they'll be so like the feeling they will mistake as the Holy Spirit confirming to them that this is all true. And so I think this is the method of this, is to make it so brilliant that when you read it, and if you're a believer, it gives you this emotional feeling that it all is true because it's so brilliantly constructed. Can only come from God. Like the word genius means spirit, right? Like it's some sort of spirit that's talking to you. This comes from Socrates. the Socrates' genius is the spirit that people were complaining that Socrates claimed talked to him. But that's the whole idea, is genius is the spirits are talking to you, right? And so I think people took that literally at the time. So I think like if Mark writes brilliantly in his construction and his language, his choice of vocabulary, the sounds, like even the sound of the language is can be cleverly constructed, that has an emotional effect on the audience. Now we just take that as brilliant art, but believers will take that as the Holy Spirit. Like they mistake the feeling as that. So I think Mark is more written for Christians, but it is written for Christians to argue with non-Christians. I think he wants that, but that's the main objective. So I don't think it's a sales pitch so much as a manual, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I believe in the scriptures it even says that true wisdom begins with God or something like that. Or I know it definitely says, "Do not lean on your own understanding, but lean on the Lord."
Well, yeah, some of the forgeries, the pastorals, I think, say, "Don't you dare interpret things yourselves. Let us do that." That's Christians talking to Christians, right? That's when they're getting hierarchical and patriarchal and saying like, no. We're in charge of interpreting shit. You guys just obey. That's a later thing. Paul would not have been totally on board with that reasoning, but then that's why he would be rolling in his grave, because they attributed that statement to him in a forgery. But yeah,
I feel like that's what a lot of apologists do now. They're like, no, don't try to do any kind of research yourself. Let me tell you what the truth is.
That's right. That is the popular recourse, and that is the Platonic recourse. That's Plato's advice. It's how you run a fascist society. He wrote the whole manual for fascism, which is the Republic, which is basically a blueprint for the Vatican. The Vatican basically instantiated in real life the entire program of Plato's Republic. I told you, like, read the Republic and ask yourself, isn't that just fucking the Vatican circa 6th century? Like, that's literally, they just became that. They just totally followed the manual. And they've always been that. And so that's why they were always like, no, we interpret it. It was the Protestants who broke that. So when Martin Luther said, no, fuck you, everybody can read the Bible, and we can interpret it however we want, and then broke the whole system. But then, of course, once you say that, because of the same reason that the Catholics shut that down, that happened with the Protestants, when they said, like, everybody can interpret it, and then everybody did. And so then the Protestants were like not in charge of anything anymore. And so like, fuck that. And so they're like saying, no, only we can interpret it. We were only properly inspired to do it. And so you get the same hierarchy being created again that they tried to destroy originally. But then everything was broken and it was just fucked. And there's no way to get the cats back in the bag at that point. But that's the history of Christianity in a nutshell.
Next up, we've got Reality Revolutions, who says, wasn't Adam eating the apple him trying to be God?
Not in the text, right? Like literally in the text, he just eats it because Eve tells him to. Like, right? Like, oh, you should eat this. No, you're not really gonna die. Like this. The snake told me that it's not real. And like, oh, okay.
Always the most convincing argument. The snake told me to do it.
No, it's literally just being a rube. Like it would be interesting. It would be more accurate to say that, and people don't know this, but there's a legend that Eve was the second wife of Adam. I don't know if everybody knows this story. So there was the first wife of Adam, which is Lilith, right? God made Lilith, but Lilith wanted to be equal to Adam, not to God, but to Adam. She just wanted to be equal to a man. And I think like the legend is that she wanted to have sex on top. And that was like, oh my God, that's hierarchy. There's no way that women can be on top. And so that's like, whore. And so she gets kicked out. She literally, they ditch her. And what does she become? She becomes the mother and queen of all the demons, right? So she's the ultimate demon. That's actually in apocryphal Jewish texts. That's actually in lore that you can find. I didn't make that up. That's an actual story. And then God made an obedient, took the rib out of Adam and made a proper subordinate, submissive woman for Adam. And that's Eve. But of course, even she fucked everything up by believing a snake. But that's, it's like, well, I don't want a smart, powerful woman. I want like a submissive, dumb woman. And you're like, well, look what happened. You got what you wanted, motherfucker. Okay.
Casey just said women just suck.
Anyway, that's the legend. That's the lore. So what do we
Right.
got?
Okay, next up, we've got Satan's Little Helper, who says, even granting these stories, there is no way for us to falsify it. A grim story like a global flood would be grand, and if a man did it even grander, but that doesn't mean that they're given God granted. It would be hard to doubt.
That sounds like a second-rate AI wrote that. I don't know. I don't know what's being asked here, but
I'm not too sure either. I
there's
think
no
that
evidence of a global flood. That's been refuted,
Yeah.
so we know that's false. We could totally falsify that. We have. There's lots of ways to falsify it, and all the falsifications have come out. Yeah, I don't know what else. I guess can I steel man this?
yeah.
There have been catastrophic floods throughout the world. They haven't flooded the whole world, but all major civilizations tend to grow up in river valleys because they're very fertile and therefore very wealthy. And so that's where urban environments first arose. So you get the Nile Valley, you've got the Euphrates Valley, the Yangtze Valley in China. And what do river valleys tend to do is flood catastrophically on periodic occasions. So all these civilizations had catastrophic flood memories because they just, like, they're dumbasses and built their cities in the swamps, right? Like, so that's literally what happened, because that's where all the money was, and they're not thinking ahead. And so that's what happened. But all of these civilizations had different flood myths because the structure of the way floods worked was different. So Egypt actually depends on the flood. It actually needed the flooding to fertilize its fields. So they actually built their society to endure flooding. So they actually said, okay, it's going to flood. Everybody get up to the hills. Like, it's like, yes, flooding, excellent. It's going to be a good season. So that their entire society was built around loving the flood. The flood was great. That's what they wanted. They wanted it to happen. That's why it was a huge, catastrophic, big political deal when they dammed it, like the Aswan Dam. Shutting that down was like, oh my God, what are you doing? It's like, well, we got new architecture and hydrological technology. We don't need the flooding method anymore, which is true. But it was a big deal when they did that because the whole society was based on flooding. Euphrates Valley was different. Like, they didn't build it that way. Floods were catastrophic. Everything got wiped out. And they said, whatever, we'll just build it up and then complain about it and like blame gods and heroes and stuff. And so they wrote the Gilgamesh story, and that was the legend of it. Now, when you go to China and you look at their flood myth is my favorite of all the flood myths, is that you have the gods are going to fuck man over, just like all the other flood myths. And they're going to, flood the world. But the emperor says, well, fuck you. I've got hydrological engineers. And he sends his engineers out and they fix it. And so humans defeat God. Like, that's the lesson. It's like they built all the dams and dikes and hydrological engineering, and they defeated God. They defeated the flood. And they're like, fuck you. And that's the Chinese legend. I'm like, yes. I'm with them. I like their way of dealing with the fucking asshole God. It's like, no, we'll just send engineers.
Yeah,
anyway, that's my rant.
Engineers.
On that question.
I'm glad you think positively about engineers.
Of course, the society depends. Society depends on two things. Well, now three things: programmers, so coders, engineers, and machinists. Our entire society is built on those three things. Even farmers can't farm anymore without those three things because they're totally dependent on the tech.
I meet two of those categories, so I'm very valuable.
Yeah, people don't realize the machine. I don't have the book right next to me, but there's a book called 60 Years of Men and Machines. I might have the title wrong, but it's something like that. And it's written by a guy who was a machinist in the 19th century, and he lived and was a machinist all the way to robots. So he saw everything from late 19th century to the 1960s with the invention of factories that just robotically built cars. And his whole book is about like how crucial to national security and to economies and everything that the machinist is, because the machinist builds the fundamental parts and tools and models on which everything else in society is based, right? And this is a person in society that we don't notice or realize how much we depend on them. As coders is the same way. Like we don't really think too much about like how fundamentally we depend on those people. And like if they all disappeared suddenly, we'd be fucked. And it's the same way like now we do, because we built our society on, programming. But even with material culture, machinists are super important. I highly recommend that book. It's a great book because it covers that 100 years of history, like it's 50 years or something, but a little bit more, like 60 or something, but of the history of how our civilization changed, like fundamentally changed in the way we did this. But even when it was changed, we still needed machinists. Now we got robots that do a lot of it, but they can't do all of it. So someone who literally machines the fundamental model that we use to manufacture everything else from. Like there's always someone who's doing it. But anyway, yeah, it's one of the most important things in society that people don't know, because they're working at just the bottom of the whole system of building things, basically. So that's a great book I recommend people look at.
Awesome. Next up is Aaron Adair. He sent a super chat. Aaron says, this convo has cleared up my discussion with Richard earlier. Agree the evidence better favors Anatole equals Jesus than I argued earlier.
Cool. Yeah. That's why I was convinced by it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm glad that this conversation has already helped somebody. Thank you so much there, Aaron, and everybody else that has sent in the super chat. I really appreciate everybody. So Jacob B's got another one saying that distinction between how it is read versus what it reads as is essential. Platonists read Homer as a Platonist, but he was not. Christians read the Bible in a wacky way, just like today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's important. If you're going to understand an author, you got to understand what perspective they're coming from. And you can't assign an incorrect perspective to them. Homer is a classic example. Yeah, the Platonists were reading wackadoo things out of Homer. Later on, if you look at because they were so embarrassed by how immoral the values in Homer are. So you read like Plutarch and other authors write whole essays on how we're supposed to reinterpret Homer to make him more ethical, so that it won't offend children or whatever. But yeah, they're trying to reinterpret, assign new meanings to things to get them to mean different things. By the time Philo's doing it, their whole system of how they do this was really weird. But you can study it. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have lots of other writings. We have Philo's writings. So you can actually study what is Philo doing with this stuff? What are other rabbis doing with this stuff? So there is a way to get at how they're approaching it. And yeah, it's absolutely different from what the original authors are doing. But even both of those things are completely different from what we're doing now. So like we today, and I don't want to give the anachronism argument again, because there were textual criticism was invented in antiquity. It was one of the things that the Alexandrian scholars after Alexander the Great in the Hellenistic period developed a lot of the skills that we use now of text criticism. And so a lot of their manuscript transmission was controlled by this analysis of how do we correct mistakes, how do we find out what the original reading was, etc. That was all built then, but not everybody followed it. And Philo's not one of the people following that. He's outside that tradition. He's doing his own thing. But he is in a tradition of his own that we have lots of examples of. So we can study his tradition and know what he's doing. But he's not doing what the Alexandrian scholars are doing. They're doing the text critical stuff. He's not doing that. They did exist. It's just not him. And so that is important. If we're going to read this stuff, we got to know that.
Right. Exactly. Thank you so much, Jacob, for your super chat. Next up is Rainbow Krampus, who asks, where can I read more about the sperm absconding angels asking for a friend?
Well, so I discovered this after on the Historicity of Jesus. It will be in the second edition, but it is in Jesus from Outer Space. I have that here somewhere. Where's my Jesus from Outer Space? Here it is. Nope. There it is. Yeah. Jesus from Outer Space. So this is short, it's a easy read that summarizes on the Historicity of Jesus. It has a concordance to on the Historicity of Jesus in the back. So you can, if you want the footnotes and the scholarship and all of that, you can use the two books together. But that book, I do include the discussion of Layla and the citation. I can't get at it right now. Oh yeah, I learned it from that encyclopedia is amazing. I highly recommend that. That actually covers the whole history, so it goes all the way to modern stuff. So it's got Kabbalah and stuff in it, but it does have a lot of ancient stuff. I found so many cool things in that, and I could double check it, because he has citations. So in his entries, you can actually say, "Oh, that sounds weird. That can't be true," and so you can actually follow up his breadcrumb and find out, like, "Oh crap, he's not joking. This is actually the case." And you can find out what's medieval, what's ancient, what's modern, etc. So it's a super handy book. I just read it cover to cover, like it's written like a dictionary. So you like with entries alphabetically, but I just read it cover to cover. It was, I learned a ton of things from this book. It's surprisingly good. I was astonished at how effective this scholar was in gathering so much weird stuff from such a wide span of periods.
And just to give a little bit more information to Krampus, I believe it was demons that collect your nighttime emissions, which would be, or nocturnal emissions, which would be wet dreams. Like if you wake up and you've mysteriously cummed your britches while you're sleeping, that's because a demoness jerked you off.
There's a medieval text, Jewish text, where this was a fear, and they had all of these like techniques, like magic, to help them, and like don't sleep in this particular way, don't do this or whatever, or these demons will come and steal your sperm. They were usually imagined as female demons who would like have sex with you, and this was bad. Can't let them do that, because they would take your sperm and they would do awful things with it. That's the thing.
Do awful things with it, but yeah. I feel like Krampus is like, they can do whatever awful thing they want.
Yeah.
Oh man, thank you so much there, Krampus. Did you have any other thoughts on that carrier?
No, I'm good.
Sperm stealing
that's
demons.
That's Layla. You want to look into the angel Layla. It's in the Talmud, but the exact citation is in Jesus from Outer Space.
Yep. All right. Thank you, Krampus. Then we got the Mythic Life, who says, a good way to get out of communion. Explain what the body of Christ is made from. Happy Easter and best wishes, Kristen.
So what we've all been talking about, David's sperm.
Yeah.
I mean, it was either that or just made out of nothing, right? Like God just made it. Even Adam got supposedly made out of mud, right? So it is true that the way they thought, God had to make it out of something. So we don't know. They don't say, right? So, but if you follow the prophecy of Nathan, they made it out of out of David's sperm. That's what they made it out of. If they didn't, they made it out of something else, like skin cells off of the inside of Mary's womb or something. I don't know. Yeah. I doubt they really thought deeply about that. But
Casey just asked, he can't bibbidi bobbidi boo it.
He could, right? But the people who are making this stuff up have to imagine that, and they don't necessarily have the widest of imaginations. But I do have to say, like, Galen complained about Jewish Christian thinkers and thinking that God can just, I think it was the way he said it was, they think God can just make a horse out of ashes, and that's ridiculous. But what I find interesting about that is that he still thought that God still needed the ashes. Right? Like, that's like, why can't he just make a horse? Like, why does he need to make a horse out of ashes? Like that. So yeah, there was still like this limited thinking that there still had to be a material present, and then maybe God could make the material first, but then he could make stuff out of the material. But he still had to do it in stages, which obviously in a true omnipotent sense that's not the case, right? But
yeah. So thank you, Kristen, for your super chat. As far as the communion goes, I'm all like, I didn't think about this until like a few weeks ago, but I'd be really hesitant about the communion wafers if it is Jesus's body, because it's like, which one of these is the butthole? Like, I mean, if it's made from Jesus's body, the butthole's got to be part of it, right?
Does Jesus have herpes? I don't know. Has he got mono?
Don't eat that speckled one.
Right. Yeah. Like, or maybe you want the mono because you don't want to get it again later, right? Like, it's, these are things to think about.
All right.
How pure is Jesus? How pure is the body of Jesus? Right.
Yeah, that's a serious question. We got to know. So this next question is from Jacob B again. But just to preface, so this is something that Neil, in the interview between T-Jump and Neil, this was mentioned. I don't know how like real it is, but Jacob B wants to know, Dr. Carrier, apparently you're set to debate T-Jump.
I'm not aware of this. So I did debate T-Jump. like that happened, like, I don't know how long ago.
Yeah.
So that happened, but no one has scheduled any debate with me. I don't know. I've heard worrying things about T-Jump since then, so I don't know if I would debate him, but no one scheduled anything with me. So,
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've heard it too, and I'm like, I don't know about that. I'll just have to wait to see if anything actually gets scheduled, like on Modern Day Debate or something. But
yeah, like I said, I don't know if I would agree to it. I would have to do some research because I've heard some disturbing things about T-Jump.
Mm-hmm. Yep. He's in case he said he's a dipshit. Rainbow Krampus with the final super chat for tonight says 5E, eh? Carrier likes to play a bard when he's not DMing. Am I right?
I have not played a bard yet. I considered it, but no. Yeah, I do play 5e. I actually not a fan of 5e. But because everybody else plays it, if I'm going to play D&D, or when I play role-playing games, I'm kind of stuck having to play 5e. And so I'll do it, and therefore I'm an expert in it simply for that reason. But I prefer other systems. And actually, I have my own homebrew system that I run if I'm running a game, and if I have a say in what I'm running. But there are other games. Like I've got the Expanse role-playing game. I just recently got a role-playing game that's based on Miyazaki films. So Hayao Miyazaki, like the whole theme. Anyway, so I've got a huge collection of role-playing games, and I love playing other systems than D&D, but I don't usually get to because I don't have anybody who wants to play them usually. So usually if you want to find players, you got to play 5e, which is a bit limiting.
So what's 5e? I don't play
D&D. So yeah, D&D, like there's going to be a 6th edition. It's coming out soon, but it's gone through multiple editions. 5e has become so canonical that you can just literally type 5e in Google, and any other string that you have after that, Google knows immediately what you're talking about. that's how fucking established 5e is. It's become that fixed. But anyway, yeah, 5e is the current system of D&D, which I think was established sometime in the early 21st century. I can't remember exactly when, but it's been the standard for a while.
Yeah. One final one. Skeptics and Scoundrels. He says wubba lubba dub dub, which is a Rick and Morty thing. Which y'all can't see it. Y'all can't see it, but I have a mat for my desk so I don't like scuff up my desk. It's Rick and Morty. So I definitely.
I didn't know if he was downing martinis like I was. I don't know. That's what's going on. Well,
the guy that says it, he definitely drinks way too much. But I just had a Coke and whiskey tonight. But thank you so much, Carrier, for coming on here and clearing up some of this stuff about Philo's Angel. I mean, I can only do so much in my own videos, and that's, you use your extensive work on it, but also follow your citations and use people there, which I've actually, when you were discussing like how you're supposed to read like authors and what they meant and everything like that, I actually have a clip of Bart Ehrman making the same statements that you did. Yeah. And I'll use that clip because like the last time I used it was when I analyzed Tim O'Neill, and it's kind of like, oh, Bart Ehrman disagrees with you there, Tim.
Yeah. No, I agree. That's important, and it's worthwhile getting out. I think this has been a great show. I think we've like covered a lot of really great topics and cleared up a lot of things. So I think this will be useful.
Yes, definitely. And I'm going to break it up into smaller chunks so that people will watch those chunks. But in any case, thank you so much there, Dr. Carrier. Do you want to let people know like where they can find you and all that kind of stuff in case they,
well, obviously richardcarrier.info has all things me. Explore it. Like I said, there's classes, books, ways to support me like Patreon. There's my blog. Follow that. My Facebook and Twitter and all of that thing. But I'll just do an extra bump for the Myth Vision course. There will be more of those. So like once you take one, you'll get an idea of what it's like. And if you like it, and as I drop more throughout the year, you can get into those too. But yeah, like John gets a small commission. I get a little bit commission on that. So check those out, like the New Testament Studies course, which I think there's a link below the video on that.
Yes, definitely. And the link is godlessengineering.com/NT studies course. And, as I get affiliate links and everything like that for the other courses that Carrie's going to do, I'm going to have those down in the description as well.
Yeah.
So you can just look down there for any updates or anything like that. Again, really appreciate you coming here. And I guess that I will just see you later there, Carrie. I'll let you have the rest of your night.
Thanks. Yeah. Rock
All
on,
right.
guys.
Yep. See everybody later. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and all that kind of good shit. Bye, heathens.